My name is Victor, and I'm 72 years old. Up until a few weeks ago, I actually thought I was settling into a peaceful, well earned retirement. Then my son in law barged into my house, slammed his designer duffel bag onto my custom antique walnut table, and ordered me to clear out. He told me his family needed the best room in the house, and that it was my job to make space for them. I just stood up slowly, gave him a calm smile, and told him to pack up his crap and get the hell out. I figured that would be the end of his entitled arrogance, but I had absolutely no idea that he was holding a piece of paper that was about to turn my final sanctuary into a war zone. Before we get into the rest of this story, if you've ever had to teach a lesson to an arrogant relative that they'll never forget, let me know in the comments below where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me tell you exactly how this nightmare started. The heavy mahogany doors of my historic equestrian estate in Middleburg, Virginia, weren't just pushed open, they were practically kicked in. The massive thud echoed through the quiet living room, instantly shattering the peace and quiet I spent decades working for. I looked up from my leather armchair. Trent, my 38-year-old son-in-law, stormed into the room with my daughter Chloe, following silently behind him. Trent was wearing his signature Silicon Valley Tech Bro uniform, an expensive custom shirt under a fleece vest with pricey loafers and no socks, looking completely ridiculous against the backdrop of a historic country horse farm. He didn't even bother taking off his mud-caked shoes, leaving a trail of dirty footprints across the handmade Persian rug that used to be my late wife's absolute favorite. He walked straight to the center of the room and slammed that heavy leather duffel bag onto the glass top of the antique coffee table. The glass let out a painful groan under the sudden weight. I stared at the bag, then looked up at him, waiting for some kind of explanation for this complete lack of manners. Trent didn't bother with a basic greeting. He crossed his arms, puffed out his chest, and used the exact same tone he probably uses to chew out his employees. "Listen up, old man," he demanded, his voice bouncing off the high wooden ceilings. "My parents and the rest of the Sterling family are coming over this weekend. There are going to be 25 people in total. We're hosting a huge celebration party for a tech startup merger, and we're turning it into a family reunion. You need to clear out of the master suite today and move all your junk into the old tack room behind the stables." I stayed completely silent, letting his words sink in. I looked past him at my daughter, Chloe. The girl I spent my entire life raising and protecting wouldn't even make eye contact with me. She stared down at the floor, shifting her weight uncomfortably and nervously spinning the massive diamond engagement ring on her finger. She was completely complicit in this. Chloe finally looked up and weakly muttered, "Dad, please, just do what he says. It's only for a few days. We really need everything to be absolutely perfect, and some big Silicon Valley venture capitalists are going to be here." Her weakness made me sick to my stomach. Trent took my silence as a sign of submission and kept right on going with his arrogant rant. "This place is way too big for you anyway," he sneered, looking around the room with obvious disgust. "You just sit around here doing nothing all day. We're going to make this asset actually do something for us. This is basically our early inheritance anyway, so as of today, we're taking over. My parents are taking the master bedroom because they actually appreciate luxury and need the space. Everyone else gets the guest rooms. You can stay in the tack room, and when the high-end catering team gets here tomorrow morning, you go out there and help them. Stop getting in the way and try to make yourself useful." The sheer audacity of his words hung heavily in the air. This entitled tech punk honestly believed he could just walk into my home and order me around like hired help. I slowly uncrossed my legs and stood up from my chair. I'm a tall man, and despite my age, I still have the intimidating build from spending most of my life working as a forensic accountant and a federal investigator. I walked around the coffee table and stepped right up to him, forcing him to look up at me. I gave him a very calm, freezing cold smile. "I'm giving you exactly 5 seconds to get that bag off my table," I said, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. "And then You're going to pack up your things and get off my private property." Trent had absolutely no clue who he was dealing with. He looked at me and just saw a retired Italian American guy who likes to mow the lawn on weekends and feed his old horses. He thought I was an easy target. He assumed this multi-million-dollar estate was some lucky windfall or just an ordinary asset he could easily push me out of. What he didn't know was that I spent 20 years as a lead undercover auditor for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division before starting one of the most aggressive private forensic accounting firms in the country. I didn't have a trust fund, and I never inherited a single dime. I spent freezing rainy nights digging through mountains of money laundering ledgers. I went toe to toe with dangerous cartel money launderers, and I personally sent powerful Wall Street executives who thought they owned the world straight to federal prison. I bought this land 25 years ago when it was nothing but mud and abandoned old barns. I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building it into what it is today. I personally oversaw the renovation of every single building, and every piece of stable wood and fireplace stone was bought with money I risked my life for. This place was my sanctuary. I built it for my late wife, Clara. It was supposed to be our quiet retreat, away from all the noise and greed of the Washington, D.C. political and business world. Ever since she passed away, this house has been the only place where I can still feel her presence. Every single corner of this house holds the memories of the life we built together. And now, this arrogant crypto startup owner who married my daughter thought he could just swoop down like a vulture, take my sanctuary, and use it as a weekend clubhouse to show off his wealth. He genuinely believed his privilege and fancy CEO title gave him the right to erase my entire life's work. He completely miscalculated the situation. I wasn't some fragile old man waiting to die. I'm a man who specializes in seizing assets and destroying financial empires. He thought he was standing on solid ground, but he had no idea I controlled every single trapdoor beneath his feet. Instead of backing down or showing even a shred of respect, Trent let out a loud, mocking laugh. He looked at me like I had just told a pathetic joke. "You really think you still call the shots around here?" he asked, a nasty smirk spreading across his face. He reached into the inside pocket of his designer jacket and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. He slammed it down on the glass tabletop right next to his dirty bag. "Open your eyes and take a good look, old man." I slowly picked up the paper. It was an official, durable power of attorney. It explicitly granted Chloe and Trent complete legal control over this property and all related assets. I scanned the text quickly, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. Right there at the very bottom of the page was my signature. It was completely real. My mind raced, trying to figure out how this was possible. Then the horrible truth hit me like a runaway freight train. Last month, I was in the hospital for a minor gallbladder surgery. I was heavily medicated on painkillers and barely conscious. Chloe came to visit me with a thick stack of hospital discharge papers and complicated medical insurance forms. She rushed me to sign them, saying it was the only way I could finally go home. I trusted my daughter completely. I didn't read through every single page before signing. She had secretly slipped this asset transfer document right into that stack of medical paperwork. Trent stepped in close, a vicious look of triumph in his eyes. "Too late, old man," he whispered. "Chloe already signed over the property management rights to me. You're nothing but a guest in this house now. So pack your things and get out to the tack room before I call the local sheriff to throw you off this estate for trespassing." The game was officially on. I slowly lowered the fraudulent document and turned my eyes away from Trent. I looked straight at Chloe, the little girl I used to carry on my shoulders at 4th of July parades, the daughter I took high-risk overseas auditing cases for just to pay for her expensive Ivy League tuition, was standing right in front of me. She refused to meet my gaze. She kept her eyes glued to the wood grain on the floorboards, like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. The silence in the room was suffocating, heavy, and toxic. I waited for her to speak up, waited for her to say this was all just a bad joke, waited for her to rip that paper out of her husband's hands and apologize for this massive insult. But she didn't do a thing. She just stood there, hiding behind the man who was trying to steal my home out from under my feet. In that exact moment, my heart didn't break. It just turned completely to ice. The profound feeling of being betrayed by my own blood washed over me, replacing the last bit of fatherly warmth left inside me with a cold, hard, calculated clarity. She wasn't my little girl anymore. She was a grown woman who had actively chosen to be part of a calculated conspiracy against her own father. I took a deep breath, and without raising my voice, I demanded an explanation. "Look at me, Chloe," I said. "Look me in the eye and tell me you agree with this." She finally looked up, and the look on her face was a pathetic mix of guilt and extreme impatience. She actually seemed annoyed with me for making things difficult. "Dad, please don't make this a scene," she pleaded, stepping out from behind Trent. "We're just trying to help you. You're getting older, and managing a massive estate like this, all by yourself, is just too much. We're doing this for your own good." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. "For my own good?" I repeated. "I'm 72, Chloe, not 92. I run 8 miles a week on the horse trails. I manage my own complex trust accounts, and I personally hired the people to landscape every single inch of this property. Where exactly do you think I need help?" Trent stepped forward, throwing his arm around my daughter's shoulders in a possessive way. "You've been forgetting things, old man," he interrupted. "Last year, you missed a critical deadline for the agricultural property tax filing. Chloe is just stepping up as a responsible daughter to make sure your assets are protected. This is completely legal. We're the managers now." I remembered that so-called missed deadline perfectly. The only reason I was 3 days late paying it was because I had to fly out of state to arrange my brother's funeral. They were intentionally weaponizing my grief from losing a sibling just to paint a fake picture of me being old, senile, and incompetent. Chloe nodded eagerly, going along with his ridiculous and insulting logic. "Exactly, Dad," she said, forcing a fake confidence into her voice. "Trent knows how to handle real estate and capital operations. He's a startup CEO with a venture capital background. He's going to make sure the value of this place is maximized. We can even rent it out to foreign diplomats for top dollar when we aren't using it. It's a smart business move. You should be thanking us for taking this massive burden off your shoulders so you can actually enjoy your golden years." I felt a wave of pure disgust wash over me. She was just repeating his words like a brainwashed parrot. She had sold out her morals and her family loyalty for the fake illusion of Washington high society that Trent and his awful family supposedly offered. Before I could rip into her ridiculous argument and teach them both a lesson, a loud symphony of car horns suddenly blasted from the driveway. The jarring noise broke the tense silence inside the house. The Sterling family had arrived. I looked out the large front window and saw a convoy of 3 black luxury Range Rovers pulling up my driveway. Their heavy tires ruthlessly crushed the pristine white gravel I had just put down the week before. The doors flew open, and a loud, arrogant crowd of people spilled out like locusts, laughing loudly and shouting across the yard at each other. They acted like they had just arrived at a 5-star resort they rented out for a wild weekend getaway. Trent grinned from ear to ear, clapping his hands excitedly. "Awesome! The whole family is finally here," he announced, turning back to glare at me with a smug, malicious look. "Remember what I said, old man. Get out to the tack room and stay out of our way. We have a ton of bags to unpack, and we don't need you lingering around the living area." Standing by the window and watching the chaos outside, the brutal reality of their deception started clicking together perfectly in my forensic auditing brain. This wasn't just a sudden burst of greed. This was a carefully planned ambush designed to take me down when I was at my absolute weakest. 4 weeks ago, I was admitted to the hospital for a routine gallbladder removal surgery. The surgery went fine, but the heavy anesthesia and powerful painkillers left me completely disoriented for the next 2 days. Chloe came to see me every single afternoon while I was recovering. I thought she was being a dutiful, loving daughter. Yes, she brought me warm soup, held my hand, and talked endlessly about how worried she was about my health. On the day the doctor finally cleared me to go home, She walked into my hospital room holding a clipboard with a thick stack of densely written paperwork. She told me they were standard hospital release forms and complicated insurance claims that needed my immediate signature. She pointed to the bottom of the pages, showing me exactly where to sign so we could finally go home and I could rest in my own bed. I trusted her completely because she was my own flesh and blood. Without putting on my reading glasses or checking the fine print, I signed every single page she put in front of me. She had carefully hidden that durable power of attorney right in the middle of that stack of medical documents. My own daughter had weaponized my illness, my grogginess, and my absolute trust just to steal the roof over my head. My late wife Clara always warned me about this. She saw what I refused to see. Clara used to say that Chloe's desperate need to fit in with the wealthy, powerful crowd and her bottomless hunger for validation would eventually destroy her morals. I never wanted to believe it. I always wanted to see the best in my kid. But standing there right now, looking at that stolen signature on that document, I realized Clara had been absolutely right all along. The sweet daughter we raised was completely gone, replaced by a stranger totally blinded by greed and superficial ambition. She had sold me out just to be accepted by a family that didn't even respect her. The heavy front door swung open again and Arthur Sterling walked in. Arthur was Trent's father, a man who carried himself with an unearned arrogance, the kind unique to people who inherited old family wealth and never worked a hard day in their lives. Wearing a crisp Ralph Lauren polo shirt and expensive loafers, he looked around the estate I built with a critical, judging eye. He didn't even bother to greet me or look me in the eye like a human being. He looked at me like I was a piece of junk furniture that needed to be thrown out. "Well, it's got a bit of rustic charm, I guess," he muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Needs a complete modern overhaul, but the potential of this acreage is decent." His wife, Eleanor, an equally terrible snob, walked in behind him, complaining loudly that the country air was going to ruin her fresh blowout. Then Arthur walked straight up to me, stopping just a few feet away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a heavy set of car keys, and tossed them carelessly right at my chest. Purely out of instinct, I caught them before they hit the floor. "Hey, Chief," he said with a condescending smirk, using the exact tone you'd use with a valet at a high-end restaurant. "That black Range Rover is blocking the driveway. Move it over to the side garage, and then start bringing our bags up to the master suite. Be careful with those Hermes leather bags, though. They cost more than a year of your retirement pension." Trent and Chloe stood there, watching the whole interaction. Trent was grinning from ear to ear, clearly loving every second of the humiliating treatment. Chloe looked away again, too cowardly to step in or say a single word to defend her own father. They were fully expecting me to yell, to slam the keys back into his face, or to start a massive fight so they could record it and use it as proof that I was mentally unstable and dangerous. But I didn't give them that satisfaction. I didn't scream, and I didn't lose my temper. I just gripped that heavy set of keys, gave Arthur a completely blank, emotionless stare, and turned toward the door. I walked out into the chilly autumn wind and headed straight for his luxury SUV. But I had absolutely no intention of parking his car or carrying his expensive luggage. The second I was out of their sight, I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and turned on a miniature digital audio recorder. It was a professional habit I picked up from years of working in federal agencies and auditing the books of corrupt multinational corporations. I always recorded hostile interactions. This hostile takeover had just escalated, and they had absolutely no idea that I already held all the cards to win this game. I walked down the driveway and tossed Arthur's heavy car keys right onto the hood of his brand new SUV. I didn't move the car, and I definitely didn't touch a single piece of his luggage. I walked around the wraparound porch and took a slow, steady path toward the staff entrance at the side of the house, intending to grab a few essentials from the mudroom. As the sun dipped behind the tall pine trees, the temperature started dropping fast, casting long, dark shadows across the estate. I reached out with my cold fingers and punched my usual 6-digit passcode into the keypad of the smart lock. The keypad flashed an angry, bright red and let out a sharp error beep. I paused, figuring my finger had just slipped in the freezing wind. I carefully entered the numbers a second time. Another red light, another sharp beep. Access denied. The heavy metal deadbolt didn't budge, locking me out of the home I built brick by brick. I looked up at the small security camera mounted right above the door, feeling a deep chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air. A second later, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Trent. It read, "Just updated the security codes for the whole estate for our safety. The tack room above the stables is unlocked. Sleep well tonight, old man." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the words over and over again. He had intentionally locked me out of my own home in the freezing cold, forcing a 72-year-old man to sleep in an unheated, dusty old tack room. It was a calculated, cruel act of physical and psychological abuse. I stood on the porch for a long time, letting the freezing wind hit my face and cut right through my thin jacket. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room, I could see the warm, golden light spilling out onto the patio. I could see the silhouettes moving around inside. The Sterling family had completely made themselves at home, taking over the space like a swarm of well-dressed locusts. I turned around, turning my back on the warm house, and walked down the dirt path toward the distant stables. I pushed open the creaking wooden door and walked up the narrow stairs to the old tack room, stepping into the dark, dusty space. The air inside was incredibly stale, smelling heavily of leather saddles, dried hay, and old engine oil. It was freezing cold, and the uninsulated walls did nothing to block out the harsh weather. I flipped the switch, turning on the single bare bulb hanging overhead, which instantly flooded the room with a harsh yellow light. Trent hadn't bothered to set anything up for me. No bed, no heater, no blankets. He expected me to sleep on the hard wooden floor like a stray dog. I walked over to a stack of plastic storage bins filled with old horse blankets and burlap sacks, pulling out a few old moving blankets I used to protect tractor parts. I spread them out over a pile of flattened cardboard boxes in the corner, making a makeshift bed. I sat down on the cold cardboard, pulling my jacket tight around myself and rubbing my hands together to generate a tiny bit of warmth. From the main house up the hill, I could hear the muffled, thumping bass of loud music and the rowdy laughter of the Sterling family echoing across the property. They had lit up my expensive outdoor grill, and I could smell the rich scent of the prime Wagyu beef I had bought for myself earlier that week. I could hear Arthur's loud voice bragging about some country club polo match, while Eleanor shrieked with laughter, complaining about the terrible cell service out here. They were celebrating this hostile takeover without an ounce of guilt. They were drinking my vintage Bordeaux, eating my food, and sleeping in the antique bed I personally picked out for my late wife, Clara. That level of disrespect and pure arrogance would be enough to make any weaker man storm up there, smash the windows, and demand his house back. But I just sat on my cardboard bed, breathing in the freezing air and controlling my heart rate. I'm not a reckless man who reacts on angry impulses. I'm an auditor who spent his entire life auditing hidden books, finding financial loopholes, and tracking down an enemy's fatal weakness. Trent thought that by locking me away in a run-down shack in the backyard, he had completely isolated me and stripped away all my power. He thought he was the smartest guy in the room, playing a high-stakes game of real estate chess against a helpless, senile old fool. He had absolutely no clue that he had just locked himself inside a digital trap of my own design. The thing Trent and Chloe completely failed to understand was the true depth of my professional skill set. When I told them I did forensic accounting, I kept it incredibly simple, just to fit their narrow, privileged minds. During my long career, I didn't just check boxes on IRS tax forms or help corporations track down embezzlement. I specialized in infiltrating and cracking advanced cyber systems that protected billions of dollars in illegal offshore funds. I excelled at building invisible data surveillance networks to bring down shell companies used for money laundering. 15 years ago, when I completely modernized this estate, I didn't just call some local security company to slap a few alarms on the doors and windows. I personally wired this entire property from the inside out. I installed top tier miniature cameras inside the vents of the custom woodwork and embedded them directly into the masonry of the stone fireplaces. I built a highly secure closed loop network system that ran entirely on an independent hidden server, which happened to be hidden right behind the paneling of this old tack room. I originally built this system to ensure Clara had absolute security, back when I was forced to travel overseas to track multinational financial flows. It was my way of keeping her safe when I couldn't be there myself. Trent thought he was a brilliant tech genius because he changed the front door code using a smartphone app. He had absolutely no idea that every single room in that house was streaming crystal clear, high definition video and audio directly to my private server this very second. He thought he had kicked me out and blinded me. In reality, he had just perfectly placed himself inside a transparent observation cage with zero blind spots, where I could monitor his every move, every word, and every single fatal mistake. I got up from my cardboard bed and walked over to the back wall of the tack room. Reaching behind a stack of old leather saddles, I pulled away a loose wooden panel that blended in perfectly with the rest of the wall. Hidden behind it was a heavy-duty, commercial-grade steel safe built right into the framing. I punched in my 12-digit mechanical combination, pulled open the heavy steel door, and a high-performance terminal laptop and a dedicated server array lit up, humming quietly in the cold air. I booted up the machine, bypassed 3 separate layers of encrypted security, and logged into my master control interface. Instantly, the massive screen split into 12 live, high-definition camera feeds from inside the main house. I could see absolutely everything. I watched Eleanor digging through Clara's old jewelry boxes in the master bedroom, carelessly tossing aside the sentimental keepsakes she deemed cheap. I watched Arthur in the kitchen pouring himself a massive glass of my rarest single malt scotch, gulping it down like tap water. But it was the crystal clear feed of the main living room that caught my full attention. Trent was pacing frantically back and forth in front of the massive stone fireplace, a phone pressed tightly to his ear. He looked completely anxious and unhinged, a far cry from the arrogant punk who had kicked open my front door this afternoon. He was sweating through his fleece vest, nervously chewing on his thumb. I isolated the audio feed from the fireplace microphone and turned up the volume, making sure to catch every single word. Trent was speaking in a hushed, panicked tone. "Yes, I completely understand the deadline," he snapped, rubbing his forehead aggressively. "The collateral is fully secured, I promise you. I am standing in the asset right now. It's a custom historic equestrian estate in an exclusive zip code. Open market valuation is at least 35 million, probably more. I have the legally executed durable power of attorney in hand. We can move forward with the $5 million venture capital bridge loan immediately. I need those funds cleared into my startup's account by Monday morning, or we are completely wiped out and looking at an SEC federal investigation. Do you hear me? Monday morning." I sat back in the freezing tack room, staring at the glowing screen as the massive scale of his crime washed over me like a cold wave. Trent wasn't just here to give his awful family a free weekend getaway. His tech startup and crypto fund, which he constantly bragged about to the press, was completely collapsing under the weight of his own massive incompetence and embezzlement. He was weaponizing my home as collateral for a fraudulent $5 million VC loan, just to save his own skin and avoid spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He was stealing my life's work to bail himself out of a massive failure. I leaned back in my chair, a freezing smile creeping onto my face. This game wasn't just about a stolen house anymore. This was federal wire fraud. The early morning mountain wind was sharp as a razor, cutting through the gaps in the uninsulated wooden walls. I'd been awake for hours, wrapped in a heavy jacket, staring at the glowing surveillance screen. Suddenly, the heavy latch on the tack room door rattled violently. I quickly swiped the main screen away, leaving a blank black screensaver right before Chloe walked in. She was carrying a flimsy paper plate covered in cheap aluminum foil. She looked nothing like the confident, successful gallery curator I had raised. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the dusty room as if she was terrified her new in-laws might see her associating with her own father. Without even looking me in the eye, she thrust the plate toward my chest. "I brought you some breakfast," she muttered, her voice tight and defensive. "It's just some leftovers Trent ordered for everyone. Eat it, and just stay out here quietly for the day, Dad. Don't come up to the main house, and don't cause a scene. Trent's parents are already getting a headache from the altitude out here, and the last thing I need is for you to embarrass me in front of them. Try to show a little gratitude that we're even letting you stay on the property." I slowly took the flimsy paper plate from her trembling hands. The food was freezing cold, the bacon was stiff, and the eggs were rubbery. They were quite literally the scraps from the tables of the people who had violently invaded my sanctuary. I looked down at the pathetic meal, then looked up at the grown woman standing in front of me. I didn't yell, and I didn't throw the plate in her face. I just calmly peeled back the foil, took a slow, deliberate bite of the cold toast, and chewed in dead silence, staring straight into her eyes. The suffocating silence stretched out, making her visibly uncomfortable. She crossed her arms tightly, shifting her weight defensively as her expensive leather boots tapped anxiously against the wooden floorboards. "What does that look supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice cracking slightly. "We are under a massive amount of pressure right now, Dad. Trent's company is going through a critical funding round, and we are trying to manage your assets before you completely lose track of this place in your old age. You should be thanking him for stepping up." Without waiting for me to respond, she spun around on her high heels and stormed out of the tack room, slamming the heavy wooden door behind her. The loud thud echoed through the small space, sealing me back inside my freezing wooden cage. I set the plate aside, completely untouched. My patience and understanding as a father officially expired right then and there. I turned back to the terminal and rebooted the hidden server array. The hardware I had stashed in this old tack room wasn't just for monitoring cameras. It was a fully functional cyber command center, built from enterprise-grade surplus components I'd collected over a long career of tracking corporate fraud and handling IRS investigations. I activated a powerful network packet sniffer I had coded myself, designed to monitor and intercept all data traffic on my estate's local network. When Trent thought he was being clever by changing the passcode on the front door smart lock, he completely failed to realize that the entire router system for the property was still hardwired into my master administration node. He was up there right now, confidently browsing the web, handling his illegal business, and syncing his mobile devices, all on a network completely controlled by me. I watched his laptop's network address pop up on my tracking software like a glowing red beacon. He was incredibly reckless, leaving his file-sharing ports wide open and disabling basic firewalls. It took me less than 3 minutes to bypass his joke of an admin password and grant myself full, remote, administrative access to his entire hard drive. I started downloading gigabytes of his personal and professional business data directly onto my highly secure, encrypted servers. I wasn't just looking for proof of the VC loan anymore. I was hunting for the exact weapons that would dismantle his entire life, piece by piece. I sat in the freezing cold room, watching the progress bars fill up on my monitors. Every single document he thought was safely hidden away was now firmly in my hands. The arrogance of youth always underestimates the quiet patience of old age. Trent thought his Silicon Valley CEO title made him invincible, but the digital sandbox he was playing in was built on rules I helped write decades ago. I meticulously sorted through his emails, bank statements, and hidden offshore liabilities. I was building an airtight, inescapable cage around him, and he didn't even know the walls were closing in. As the encrypted files downloaded onto my servers, the pathetic truth of Trent's so-called fintech empire began to unravel. For the past 5 years, the Sterling family had been running around the elite country clubs of D.C. and Northern Virginia, bragging endlessly about their incredibly high-yield crypto hedge fund. They drove leased luxury cars, wore designer clothes, maxed out massive lines of credit, and threw lavish parties just to project a fake image of untouchable generational wealth. But the internal spreadsheets and hidden Ethereum wallet logs I dug up told a completely different, devastating story. Trent's company, Sterling Ventures, was a total catastrophic failure, a textbook Ponzi scheme. He had arrogantly and stupidly leveraged his clients' funds to make massive, high risk bets, right before the crypto market took a massive dive. His firm was bleeding capital at a terrifying rate. He owed millions to aggressive offshore investors. His corporate accounts were completely overdrawn, and he was facing an immediate, total default. The luxurious lifestyle they were flaunting in my house was nothing but a desperate, hollow front built on a mountain of debt and endless lies. They were completely broke. Arthur Sterling, the man who had tossed his car keys at my chest like I was a low-level peasant, had secretly filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection 2 years ago to keep his creditors from taking everything he had left. Trent was frantically trying to use my unencumbered $35 million estate as collateral to secure that $5 million venture capital loan. He just needed to cover his immediate margin calls and avoid a federal indictment for misusing client funds. My property was the single lifeline this family of arrogant frauds had left in the world, the only thing keeping them from drowning in the financial ruin they created. I wasn't just dealing with a group of annoying, entitled relatives throwing a party. I was dealing with a pack of desperate, cornered criminals who had nothing left to lose and were willing to steal everything I owned. I kept filtering through his messy directories, opening up several private folders, labeled with aggressive corporate acronyms and shady banking terms. Then, a specific file name caught my eye, standing out like a neon sign in the sea of dry financial documents. It was a heavily restricted PDF document sitting quietly in a hidden subfolder labeled Legal Contingencies. The file name read medical underscore diagnostic underscore report underscore Victor underscore Vance. My blood went completely cold as I double-clicked the file and watched the digital document load onto my massive screen. It was an official diagnostic report bearing the letterhead of a highly exclusive private psychiatric clinic in Washington, D.C. I scanned the pages quickly, reading the clinical description of my supposed mental state. The forged report detailed a severe case of cognitive decline, unpredictable bouts of violence, extreme paranoid delusions, and a complete inability to manage basic personal hygiene or complex financial responsibilities. I scrolled down to the final page where the concluding diagnosis was stamped, in bold, heavy text, advanced Lewy body, dementia, with severe delusional features. The signature at the bottom belonged to a Dr. Julian Croft, a notoriously high-priced concierge physician known in wealthy circles for providing special favors for clients who had enough money and were desperate enough to pay for them. I had never met this man in my entire life. I had never stepped foot inside his expensive clinic. Yet here was a legally binding document detailing the rapid deterioration of my intellect and explicitly recommending that permanent legal guardianship of my person and my entire estate be granted immediately to my son-in-law, Trent Sterling. Trent hadn't just forged a simple property authorization. He had paid off a doctor to fabricate a psychiatric diagnosis to completely strip me of my civil rights and my autonomy. He was actively planning to commit me to a high-security lockdown facility while he drained my life savings to pay off his massive debts. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on that forged signature glowing on the screen in the freezing cold tack room. This game had just escalated from property theft to a straight-up kidnapping plot. They were trying to erase me from society so they could ruthlessly swallow up everything I spent my entire life building. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned stark white. My breathing slowed, and a deep, chilling resolve settled into my bones. I wasn't just defending my property anymore. I was going to completely destroy them, ensuring they would never have the power to hurt another soul for the rest of their lives. The trap was officially set, and Trent was walking into it completely blind. By the afternoon, the burning sun was baking the Virginia Valley, and the Sterling family had moved their lavish party out onto the sprawling wooden equestrian viewing deck I built with my own hands. The rich smell of expensive Wagyu beef and imported Cuban cigars drifted on the wind right into my freezing storeroom. I watched them through the security cameras, perfectly playing the part of a wealthy, elite family. Trent was holding court by the stainless steel grill, a glass of scotch in his hand, laughing loudly. The heavy wood door of the tack room creaked open again. This time, it wasn't Chloe. Trent stood in the doorway, blocking the sunlight, a smug, twisted smirk plastered across his face. "Come on out, old man," he ordered with a dismissive wave. "We have a special guest who wants to meet you. It's bad manners to keep yourself locked up in here all day." I stepped out of the dim tack room, blinking against the blinding sunlight. Standing on the manicured lawn next to Trent was a tall, thin man wearing a custom linen suit, holding an expensive leather briefcase. He had cold, calculating eyes that scanned me from head to toe. "This is Dr. Julian Croft," Trent announced, his voice dripping with fake concern. "He's a very close family friend, and he traveled all this way out to the estate today just to check up on your health." Dr. Croft stepped forward, holding out a soft, clammy hand. This was the exact man who had signed his name at the bottom of my fraudulent dementia diagnosis. I took his hand, instantly forcing my fingers to shake violently. I let my shoulders slump down, adopting the weak, confused, and incredibly vulnerable posture of a senile old man. "Hello, Victor," Dr. Croft said slowly, using an exaggerated, patronizing tone you'd usually reserve for a toddler or someone with a severe cognitive disability. "Trent tells me you've been having some trouble remembering things lately. How are we feeling today?" I looked around the yard, pretending to be completely overwhelmed by the noise of all these entitled strangers. "Who are all these people?" I mumbled, slurring my words with just the right amount of a tremor. "Why are they at my estate? I thought Clara was making dinner tonight." Mentioning my late wife as if she were still alive was a calculated move. I watched Trent exchange an incredibly satisfied, smug look with the corrupt doctor. Dr. Croft pulled a small notepad out of his jacket pocket and clicked his silver pen. "Clara passed away 5 years ago, Victor," he said slowly, watching my reaction like a hawk. "Do you know what year it is? Can you tell me who the president is?" He was rapid-firing standard cognitive assessment questions at me in a non-clinical environment without a shred of medical authorization. He was building his fraudulent case right in front of me, trying to bait me into a violent outburst. If I yelled or demanded he get off my property, he'd log it as paranoid manic aggression. If I refused to speak, he'd log it as catatonic withdrawal. I played his sick game perfectly. I stuttered heavily, mispronounced basic words, and pretended I couldn't remember Trent's name, calling him the loud boy. I let a tiny bit of drool slip from the corner of my mouth. I stared blankly at the distant oak trees and asked if it was time for me to go to work at the IRS building. I gave them a master class in textbook senility. Dr. Croft nodded sympathetically, scribbling furiously in his notepad. "It's going to be okay, Victor," he whispered, putting a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "We're going to get you the professional help you desperately need. You won't have to worry about taking care of yourself or managing your finances anymore. Trent and Chloe are going to make sure you're taken care of in a safe facility." Witnessing the sheer evil of their plan in person was staggering. They were standing in my yard, drinking my liquor, actively plotting to strip me of my basic human rights. They thought I was a broken vessel ready to be tossed away into a locked psychiatric ward. They looked at my age and my dusty work clothes and just assumed I was an easy target who lacked the resources to fight back. They had absolutely no idea that my 40 years in the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and forensic auditing had built a massive lethal network of power in the shadows of the financial world. When you spend most of your life tracking international money laundering and dismantling fraud syndicates, you don't just make friends with local accountants and tax guys. You build deep, lifelong alliances with top-tier federal prosecutors, ruthless defense attorneys, and aggressive U.S. Marshals. I knew exactly what Dr. Croft and Trent were doing, and I knew the precise federal statutes they were breaking in broad daylight. Falsifying a medical diagnosis for financial gain is a severe federal felony. Conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and elder abuse carries mandatory minimum sentences. Identity theft and wire fraud would tack another decade onto that. While they thought I couldn't remember what day of the week it was, I was calculating their federal prison sentences in my head. I had an elite team of top legal professionals who owed me massive favors, just waiting for my signal. I didn't need to scream or throw punches to protect myself from these arrogant pricks. I just needed to let them document their own catastrophic downfall. Every word Croft wrote and every lie Trent told was just another nail in their collective coffin. They were digging a legal grave so deep they'd never see the light of day again. Dr. Croft's medical license, the source of his dirty income, was going to be shredded, and Trent was looking at the full, unbridled wrath of the SEC and the Department of Justice. Trent clapped Croft on the back, pointing toward the outdoor bar. "Let's grab a drink, Julian," he laughed loudly. "The old guy is completely gone, totally empty upstairs. Chloe can watch him while we celebrate your visit." Dr. Croft smiled, setting his expensive leather briefcase down on a small wooden table next to the tackroom door. The exact millisecond both men turned their backs to walk toward the loud crowd on the patio, I instantly dropped the act. My shaking hands became steady as a rock. My dull eyes became sharp and intensely focused. I moved with a fast, silent efficiency that would have terrified them if they had seen it. I reached into my deep jacket pocket and pulled out a miniature GPS tracker and high-sensitivity audio transmitter, a leftover piece of equipment from my old undercover auditing days. I quickly unbuckled the brass latch on Croft's briefcase and slipped the small black device deep into the lining of an interior pocket. I snapped the bag shut and slid back into my slumped, frail posture a single second before Chloe walked over to check on me. She looked at me with pure disgust, ordering me to get back inside the tack room and stop ruining their afternoon. I shuffled back into the dark, dusty space, closing the heavy door behind me. Instantly, I straightened my back and walked right over to my hidden server array. The tracker was already transmitting a flawless audio feed and pinpoint location data directly to my computer. I reached down into the floorboards and pulled out an untraceable prepaid burner phone I kept for absolute emergencies. I punched in a highly encrypted number belonging to Marcus, my personal attorney. Staring at the glowing screen, I typed out a single short message. "Marcus, initiate the spiderweb protocol." I hit send. The trap was officially deadlocked. The harsh afternoon sun cut through the dusty windows of the main garage, casting long, bright beams across the polished concrete floor. I'd been awake for hours, standing quietly in the shadows of the side door, when I heard the heavy, grinding sound of a commercial vehicle pulling up the estate's driveway. A tacky flatbed tow truck backed aggressively into my driveway, crushing the freshly laid gravel. Trent strolled out from the main house holding a cup of espresso, leading a greasy-looking man in a cheap suit straight toward my garage. Trent punched the access code into the keypad, and the massive garage door rolled up with a heavy mechanical roar. I stepped further into the shadows, wanting to see exactly what new level of theft he was orchestrating today. Sitting right in the center of the clean garage, covered by a custom canvas tarp, was my perfectly restored 1961 vintage Jaguar E-Type. It was polished to an absolute mirror finish, completely spotless. Trent walked right over to the tarp and yanked it off, exposing the gleaming British racing green paint. He pointed at my car, telling the stranger that he needed fast cash to pay off the remaining balance for the high-end catering and premium liquor for this weekend. He was planning to sell my car right out from under me to fund the fake, wealthy lifestyle he could no longer afford. The sheer audacity of his behavior was reaching an entirely new criminal high. The greasy man walked slowly around the vintage sports car, running his dirty hands over the custom paint and checking the spotless chrome bumpers. He looked at Trent and lowballed him with a ridiculously small number, a fraction of what this pristine classic was actually worth on the open market. Trent didn't even care to negotiate or demand a fair price. He just let out an arrogant laugh, telling the man he'd take the cash on the spot as long as the car was towed away today. I stepped forward out of the shadows, making my presence known in the massive space. Trent rolled his eyes and let out a heavy sigh, acting like a stray dog had just wandered into his high-end showroom. He told the buyer to ignore the old man, pointing a deeply disrespectful finger straight at my chest. He arrogantly claimed that I was nothing but a broke parasite who had been living off my wife's family money for years, insisting that I didn't own a single thing on the property anymore. He proudly announced that he was the legal owner of the entire estate and everything inside it, including the garage. The buyer looked a little uncomfortable, his eyes darting back and forth between me and this arrogant punk in a custom suit. But the pure greed inside him quickly overrode any moral objections he might have had about the shady transaction. Trent pulled out that forged durable power of attorney again, waving it around like a magic wand that gave him the right to strip away everything I owned. He signed a blank bill of sale, transferring the ownership of my vehicle directly to the stranger. Grabbing a pen, he forged my signature right on the hood of my own car, pressing the tip hard against the metal. I watched his eyes scan the stack of cash as he sneered at me, telling me that this money was finally going to be used for something worthwhile instead of just collecting dust in a new garage. He told me my time was over and that it was time for the new generation to take control. I stood completely straight, my arms crossed tightly over my chest. I didn't yell, and I didn't make a single move to physically stop them from towing the car away. The buyer handed Trent a thick envelope stuffed with $100 bills and instructed his driver to hook the Jaguar up to the flatbed with heavy metal chains. Trent counted the cash with a sickening grin on his face, looking at me like he had just conquered the world. He told me I should be grateful to him for clearing out this old junk that was taking up space in his new garage, so he could park his luxury SUV inside. Trent looked at that car and just saw a piece of scrap metal he could quickly flip for cash to buy more expensive alcohol for his pathetic, fake rich parents. He had absolutely no clue what that British racing green Jaguar actually meant to me and my family. That car wasn't something I bought for myself. I bought it 30 years ago as a gift for my late wife, Clara. It was her absolute dream car, and she treated it like a member of the family. She used to drive it down the coastal highways with the windows rolled down, blasting her favorite soul music on the radio and singing along into the wind. When she got sick and couldn't drive anymore, I spent every single weekend in this garage, rebuilding the engine and polishing the chrome, just so she could look out the bedroom window, see it sitting there, and smile. That car was a sacred relic of the woman I loved more than anyone else in this world. It was a tangible piece of her vibrant spirit that I had fiercely protected since the day she passed away. Taking over my estate was an act of financial desperation and greedy privilege, and I fully intended to handle it with cold, legal precision. But putting his filthy hands on Clara's car and selling it to a greasy stranger for weekend party money crossed a fatal and absolutely unforgivable line. In my eyes, he had just signed his absolute death warrant. I was completely willing to let the legal system handle his financial crimes and put him away in a white-collar prison for wire fraud. But touching her memory meant I was going to ensure he never enjoyed a single day of peace for the rest of his miserable life. The anger inside me turned from a slow burn into an absolute sub-zero clarity. He wasn't just a thief anymore. He was a target marked for complete destruction. I watched in total silence as the tow truck driver secured the heavy steel chains to the chassis of Clara's beautiful car. The loud clanging of metal echoed through the empty garage like a heavy funeral toll, ringing out a final warning. The greasy buyer shook Trent's hand one last time and climbed into the passenger seat of the massive tow truck. As the truck rumbled down the long gravel driveway, taking a massive piece of my heart with it, Trent turned around and looked at me with a vicious, arrogant smile. He patted the thick envelope of cash stuffed into his custom jacket pocket and ordered me to go clean the guest bathrooms before his loud family woke up. He turned on his heel and strode confidently back toward the warmth of the main house, completely oblivious to the catastrophic legal mistake he had just made. The second he was out of sight, I immediately pulled the hidden burner phone from my deep jacket pocket. I zoomed in and snapped a crystal clear, high-resolution photo of the tow truck's license plate and the company logo printed on the door. Then I walked over to the wooden workbench where Trent had carelessly tossed a duplicate copy of the fraudulent bill of sale. I took a photo of the document, clearly capturing his forged signature right next to my printed name. I opened my encrypted messaging app and sent both images directly to Marcus, my private attorney. I typed out a short, highly specific instruction right below the photos. I wrote, Trent Sterling just used forged documents to sell a stolen vehicle across state lines. Immediately add grand theft auto and interstate transportation of stolen property to the list of charges for the federal grand jury. I knew for a fact that the federal authorities would instantly look at this transaction as a major felony. Stealing a six-figure vintage car and flipping it for quick cash was exactly the kind of sloppy, desperate move that aggressive federal prosecutors love to tear apart in a courtroom. Trent thought he was outsmarting a helpless old man, but he was actually handing me the exact ironclad evidence that would lock him away in a federal penitentiary for a decade. The trap was closing in faster and harder than I could have imagined, and Trent was doing all the heavy lifting for me. By noon, the sun was high over the horse farm, but on the main wooden deck, the atmosphere was rapidly plummeting to sub-zero temperatures. I sat in front of my hidden surveillance terminal in the tack room, watching the high-definition live feeds with a calculated patience. This grand Sterling family reunion was supposed to be enjoying a lavish, five-course catered meal right about now. Trent had used that thick stack of stolen cash from selling my late wife's vintage car to hire a top-tier, high-end private catering company out of D.C. I watched him pacing frantically back and forth across the wide wooden patio, his phone pressed tightly to his ear. His face had turned a furious shade of purple, contrasting sharply with his crisp white designer shirt. The catering vans were supposed to have arrived over an hour ago. Through the outdoor microphones, I heard him screaming at the event coordinator. "What do you mean you can't get past the stone arches at the bottom of the hill?" he roared, his voice cracking with pure frustration. "Just punch in the visitor code and drive the vans up. Don't tell me the road is blocked. I own this entire estate." He slammed the phone down, hammering his fist against the wooden railing. The 25 hungry, entitled, upscale members of the Sterling family were sitting around the empty, ornate tables, complaining loudly about the terrible service. Arthur Sterling was tapping his empty crystal glass, demanding food, while Eleanor fanned herself dramatically, acting like she was about to starve to death. Trent desperately needed someone to blame for this incredibly embarrassing failure, and I knew exactly who he was coming for. Less than 2 minutes later, the heavy wood door of my tack room was kicked open for the second time this weekend. Trent stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, his fists clenched tight at his sides, radiating aggression. He marched straight toward me, pointing a shaking finger directly in my face. "What did you do to the main gate at the bottom of the hill?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the corrugated metal roof. "The catering trucks are trapped at the checkpoint. The electronic keypad is completely locked down, and the manual override commands won't take my inputs. You tampered with the control panel, didn't you, old man? You did this out of pure spite to ruin this important weekend." I sat on my humble cardboard bed, remaining completely calm as he unraveled in front of me. "I haven't touched the gate, Trent," I replied smoothly, keeping steady eye contact. "The security system automatically resets for unauthorized commercial users. Since you claim to be the legal and brilliant manager of this entire estate, you should know how to fix it." He took a step closer, towering over me, trying desperately to use his size to intimidate me. "Listen to me, you broke, pathetic old psycho," he hissed through his teeth, spraying spit. "My parents are hungry. My highly important investors are arriving soon, and they are getting impatient. If you don't hand over the master override code right now, I will personally drag you by your collar and throw you off this property myself." Chloe appeared in the doorway, looking frantic and thoroughly embarrassed by her husband's outburst. "Trent, please, stop," she pleaded weakly, grabbing his tense arm. "Maybe it's just a power grid failure down the valley. We can just take the SUVs down and escort the catering trucks up ourselves." Trent violently shoved her hand away, gripping his phone so hard his knuckles turned white. "No," he snapped, glaring at her. I'm not driving 3 miles down a dirt road to play delivery boy for lunch. The old man intentionally sabotaged the security network just to humiliate me in front of my family. I looked past him, focusing directly on my daughter, studying her pathetic posture. Are you enjoying your luxury weekend getaway, Chloe? I asked, my voice completely stripped of any fatherly warmth or sympathy. Your successful husband seems to be having quite a bit of trouble managing his newly acquired empire. Trent lunged forward, kicking a heavy plastic storage bin out of his way. Give me the master code now, he screamed. I stood up slowly, unfolding my tall frame until I was matching him eye to eye, forcing him to take a sudden half-step back. I gave him a cold, dead stare, the exact look I had spent 40 years using against hardened federal criminals. There is no code, Trent, I stated calmly. The gate isn't broken and the power isn't out. That road is legally closed to any unauthorized commercial vehicles. You can't authorize those heavy trucks to drive up here because that road doesn't belong to you. Trent stared at me like I was speaking a completely foreign language. He let out a loud, condescending scoff, running his hand through his expensive, styled hair in frustration. What kind of senile nonsense are you babbling about now? He mocked, trying to regain his fake superiority. I have the executed deed to this estate right here, and the property lines are crystal clear. That private driveway connects directly to the county road. I own the access rights, and I authorize whoever I want. And there lay the fatal flaw of arrogant men who bought their degrees and faked their financials. They never bothered to read the complex legal fine print. 25 years ago, when I bought this massive estate, I didn't just buy the 10-acre residential plot where the main house sits. Back then, I was running a highly successful forensic auditing and protection firm. To guarantee Clara absolute ironclad privacy, I personally engineered a complex split of the land zoning. That 3-mile gravel road winding from the county highway all the way up to the front gates was never included in the residential deed Trent was holding. I had purchased that entire stretch of land separately under the name of my Corporate Protection Trust, a business entity that belongs directly and exclusively to me. The estate itself is zoned as a residential asset, but that single access road is strictly classified as private corporate property. I retain the absolute legal authority and sole liability over who can and cannot use it. Trent may have successfully forged a power of attorney over my personal residential property, but he has absolutely zero legal jurisdiction over my corporate business holdings. He essentially occupied an island, while I completely controlled the only bridge connecting it to the mainland. Without direct authorization from my corporate entity, not a single commercial vehicle, delivery truck, or unapproved guest could legally cross that heavily guarded checkpoint. He thought he was the undisputed king of this massive mountain, but he was actually completely trapped inside a high-security legal cage of my own design. Trent let out a loud, forced laugh, shaking his head at my explanation in pure disbelief. "You're completely delusional," he sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You're just making up fake corporate zoning laws because you're desperately trying to hold on to whatever pathetic little control you think you have left. I'm going down there right now to break that damn gate open myself and get my food." He spun on his heel and stormed out of the dusty tack room, with Chloe nervously jogging to keep up with his angry stride. I sat back in my chair and pulled out my encrypted burner phone. I sent a single short text to the elite private security company I hired to monitor my corporate property lines. I wrote, "Enforce corporate boundary security protocol. Trespasser attempting to breach commercial access road." I turned my attention back to the high-definition surveillance screens, watching Trent's luxury SUV kick up gravel as it roared down the long, winding driveway toward the checkpoint at the bottom of the hill. 15 minutes later, the live security feed from the front gate flashed onto my massive secondary monitor. Trent slammed his car into park, jumped out, and marched furiously toward the heavy steel gates, ready to force them open with his bare hands. Before his fingers could even touch the solid metal bars, two heavy black armored SUVs with flashing amber lights blocked the road from the other side of the gate. 4 uniformed, armed private security officers stepped out, their hands resting casually on their tactical belts, radiating absolute untouchable authority. I turned up the audio feed, listening intently as the officer in charge stepped up to Trent, completely expressionless and uncompromising. Sir, you are attempting to authorize commercial traffic on a strictly private corporate road, the security officer stated in a firm voice. Please present your corporate access permit immediately, or we will be forced to turn these catering trucks around and cite you for criminal trespassing. Trent froze, staring at the armed officers and the massive steel barrier. He reached into his pockets, pulling out nothing but air. For the first time in his life, he realized he was completely backed into a corner. The lavish feast was officially busted, and the Sterling family was about to starve on the estate they thought they stole. By the time the sun reached its absolute highest point in the sky, the Sterling family's lavish reunion was rapidly devolving into complete and total chaos. I sat in the dim light of the tack room, watching the live security feeds from the main patio with a quiet, calculated satisfaction. The hostility among the 25 hungry, incredibly entitled guests was reaching a boiling point. With the high-end catering trucks blocked, there wasn't a single scrap of food up on the mountain, and the expensive alcohol they were pouring down their empty stomachs was only fueling the fire. Arthur Sterling was pacing the wide wooden deck, his face flushed a furious shade of red, as he complained loudly to anyone who would listen about the sheer incompetence of the host. Eleanor Sterling, clutching an empty crystal wine glass, turned her vicious attention directly onto Chloe. I turned up the audio, making sure to catch every single word as she looked my daughter up and down, with absolute, undisguised contempt. Your father is nothing but a useless old fool, Eleanor spat, not caring who heard her shrill, piercing voice. We graciously allowed him to stay on this estate, and he repays us by ruining our entire weekend. He is an absolute embarrassment to this family. Chloe, you go down to that filthy stable right now and tell him to fix this immediately. Otherwise, he can pack his bags and walk his old ass down the mountain today. Desperate to please this toxic family of fake millionaires, Chloe nodded frantically. She spun on her heel and practically sprinted down the dirt path toward the stables. The heavy wood door flew open and Chloe burst into the dusty tack room. Her face was streaked with tears of pure humiliation, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. Dad, you need to stop this childish game right now, she pleaded, her voice a sickening mix of a whine and a command. Trent just called from the bottom of the hill. Those armed security guards refused to let the catering trucks pass the gate. You need to call whoever you know and fix this gate issue immediately. You are ruining everything for us. I sat behind my dark computer monitors, completely motionless. I didn't offer her a chair, I didn't hand her a tissue, and I didn't provide a single ounce of fatherly comfort. You want me to fix the gate so your husband can feed the people who just publicly called me a useless old fool? I asked, my voice as hard and cold as winter ice. Chloe slammed her expensive leather boot against the concrete floor, like a spoiled, throwing a tantrum. You owe them a massive apology, she demanded, shaking her finger at me. You are completely embarrassing me in front of my new family. These are powerful, important people. Dad, you need to walk up there right now, apologize to Arthur and Eleanor for this massive inconvenience, and get on your phone to unlock that private road. I looked at the grown woman standing in front of me, completely stunned by the blind arrogance she was displaying. I decided it was time to test the absolute bottom of her moral corruption. I slowly stood up, walking over to her until we were only inches apart. Let me ask you a very simple question, Chloe, I said, maintaining a heavy, unblinking eye contact. Did you know that Trent used my forged signature to leverage this entire estate as collateral for a $5 million venture capital loan? Chloe froze instantly. The angry flush drained completely from her face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling. She snapped her eyes away, looking frantically toward the heavy wooden door, as if she was desperately searching for an escape route. You knew all about it, I stated, the realization hitting me with absolute undeniable certainty. She swallowed hard, and instead of apologizing or showing a single shred of genuine remorse, She crossed her arms defensively over her chest. Trent is just going through a temporary liquidity crisis right now, she argued, her voice rising into a frantic, sharp defense. The crypto market took an unexpected dip. We just needed to leverage the massive equity in this property to save his startup fund from going under. You have plenty of money, Dad. You've made so many investments for our future. What is so wrong with sacrificing a little bit of it to help your own daughter succeed? He would have paid it all back the second the market stabilized. You are just being selfish and stubborn. I stared at her, feeling a deep, irreversible internal break happen inside my chest. For 38 years, I had poured every single ounce of my soul, my sweat, and my financial resources into protecting and providing for this girl. When her mother, Clara, passed away, I made a silent, sacred vow over her grave that Chloe would never want for a single thing in this harsh world. I paid for her elite private schools in full, funded her incredibly lavish summer backpacking trips through Europe, and bankrolled a wildly extravagant wedding to a man I knew from day one was a shallow, incompetent fraud. I did it all because I naively believed that providing unconditional love and endless financial support would ultimately build her character. I thought my relentless backing would give her a rock-solid foundation of security. But looking at her now, seeing her so desperately defend a man who was actively committing major federal fraud against her own father, I realized my unconditional love had tragically mutated into a toxic enabling. She wasn't a helpless victim of Trent's manipulation. She was a fully cooperative, calculating participant. She had eagerly adopted the values of the Sterling family's fake privilege, deciding that my life's hard work was just a convenient resource to be plundered for her social status. The sweet daughter Clara and I raised was completely dead, replaced entirely by a greedy, unrecognizable stranger who viewed my ultimate sacrifices as nothing more than her rightful inheritance. In that exact moment, the final string of fatherly devotion snapped inside me. The warm instinct of a parent went completely dark, leaving behind nothing but cold, clinical precision and a ruthless sense of calculated detachment. I was no longer a father trying to guide a misguided, confused child. I was a battle-hardened federal auditor dealing with a hostile, dangerous parasite who had actively breached the perimeter of my security defenses. I took a slow step back, giving her a chilling, completely blank stare. "You've made your choice, Chloe," I said, my voice dangerously soft, but carrying the heavy, ultimate weight of a final judgment. "Go back up there and starve with them." I turned my back on her and walked straight over to the hidden server array behind the false wooden wall. Chloe let out a scream of pure frustration, kicking a plastic bucket across the concrete floor, before turning around and storming out of the tack room, slamming the heavy door behind her. The second the metal latch clicked locked, I pulled away the paneling and woke up my high-definition surveillance monitors. I pulled open the secure digital folder containing every single document I had intercepted and categorized. The forged, durable power of attorney, the fake medical diagnosis of dementia, illegally signed by the corrupt Dr. Croft, the fraudulent bill of sale used to steal Clara's vintage Jaguar E-Type, and the massive, incredibly detailed internal ledger proving the total bankruptcy of Trent's crypto firm. I opened an encrypted email portal, routing the connection through a specific offshore virtual private network. I attached every single piece of that lethal documentation, compiling a massive, undeniable digital dossier. I sent the encrypted file directly to Marcus Sanders, the lead investigative agent for the FBI's white-collar crime division. He was a ruthless man, and we had worked closely together years ago on a massive Wall Street corporate fraud case. In the subject line, I typed, "Comprehensive evidence of active interstate wire fraud, forgery, Ponzi scheme, and identity theft by Trent Sterling." I didn't hesitate for a single second. I reached out and clicked send. The progress bar flashed a solid bright green, confirming the successful transmission of that digital bomb. The federal trap had been officially and permanently sprung, and the countdown to their complete destruction had just begun. As the afternoon dragged on, the atmosphere on top of the mountain turned incredibly hostile. The Sterling family was starving, furious, and completely out of alcohol. Trent had to pivot his strategy immediately to save his collapsing financial empire. He couldn't feed his entitled family, but he desperately needed to lock down that $5 million commercial bridge loan before Monday morning to avoid a federal liquidation. Through my surveillance monitors, I watched him orchestrate his final, most desperate play. He had bypassed the blocked catering trucks by inviting the only man who could single-handedly approve his fraudulent loan application directly to the estate. A heavy black armored luxury SUV pulled up the gravel driveway, using a high-level corporate access code to pass right through the checkpoint gate below. The man who stepped out of that massive vehicle was Marcus Thorne, the highly influential chairman of Thorne Vanguard Capital, a venture capital giant managing billions of dollars in funding. Trent practically sprinted out the front door to greet him, smoothing down his wrinkled designer's suit and forcing a fake, confident smile. He was betting everything on this single meeting, hoping to use my massive estate as the ultimate illusion of wealth to impress the prominent billionaire and finalize his theft. I watched Marcus Thorne walk into the spacious living room, his sharp eyes evaluating the custom stonework and massive oak beams. Trent stood right by his side, puffing out his chest with unearned pride. "Welcome to my private estate," Trent bragged arrogantly, gesturing broadly as if he had laid the foundation himself. "I recently acquired the entire property through a family trust. It's completely unencumbered, highly exclusive, and serves as the perfect collateral for the rapid expansion of our joint venture." Trent was laying the foundation for his massive federal fraud right in my own living room, completely oblivious to the fact that his every word was being recorded from every single angle. I decided this was the perfect moment for me to make an appearance and help him finish digging his legal grave. I walked over to the corner of the tack room, pulling out a set of old, oil-stained canvas coveralls and a pair of worn-out leather work gloves. I grabbed a handful of dark soil and rubbed it over my cheeks and jawline, perfectly mimicking the look of a low-level, overworked stable hand. I walked out of the stables, moved around the side of the house, and entered the main building through the kitchen door. I prepared a simple silver tray with 3 cups of hot tea. Pushing open the heavy wooden door to the main living area, I shuffled inside, keeping my head lowered just enough. Chloe and Eleanor Sterling were sitting on the expensive leather sofas. The second Eleanor saw my dirty appearance. She wrinkled her nose in disgust and covered her face with her hand. The moment Trent saw me walk into the room, his grand pitch stopped dead in the middle of a sentence. His face twisting into pure rage, he immediately left Thorne's side, marching over to me and lowering his voice into a vicious, threatening hiss. "What the hell do you think you're doing, old man?" Trent demanded, grabbing my arm roughly and trying to drag me toward the hallway. "I told you to stay out in the stables. You're tracking mud all over my clean floors and ruining an incredibly important meeting." He turned back toward Thorne, letting out a nervous, apologetic laugh. "I'm so sorry about this, Marcus. He's just a hired hand. An old stable boy who came with the property when I took over. He's senile and forgets his place sometimes. I'll have someone escort him out immediately so we can discuss the financial terms of the loan in absolute peace." He tightened his grip on my arm, trying to force me out of the room like a stray dog. I didn't budge an inch, standing as solid as a steel beam. I casually pulled my arm out of his aggressive grip, looking past Trent directly at the prominent billionaire standing near the stone fireplace. The thing Trent completely failed to understand was the true hierarchy of power in the world of venture capital and forensic auditing. Marcus Thorne was a powerful man in the public eye, running a multi-billion-dollar fund that was constantly featured on the covers of national financial magazines. He attended high society dinners and commanded absolute respect in the financial sector. But real wealth and absolute power operated entirely in the shadows. Thorne hadn't built that massive fund by himself. 10 years ago, when Thorne was just a young federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice, I was his lead forensic auditing mentor on complex Wall Street fraud cases. Later, when he started his own venture capital fund and was on the brink of total liquidation due to aggressive over-leveraging and terrible market projections, I was the secret, unnamed partner who saved him. I had injected $80 million of untraceable corporate capital, restructured his debt, and pulled him back from the edge of absolute bankruptcy. Vance Forensics, an auditing group, my primary holding company, held the absolute majority stake in Thorn Vanguard Capital. Marcus Thorn was not an untouchable billionaire acting on his own accord. He was my direct employee. He reported exclusively to me on every major transaction, managing my massive portfolio under strict non-disclosure agreements to protect my absolute privacy. We had acquired downtown skyscrapers and massive shipping ports together, and my name had never appeared on a single public document. Trent was frantically trying to secure a $5 million loan from a fund that I privately owned, using my own stolen house as fraudulent collateral. He was quite literally begging my own employee for my own money. The absolute irony of the situation was almost too perfect. Trent thought he was a financial mastermind playing in the big leagues, but he was really just an ignorant little thief trying to steal crumbs out of a giant's picnic basket. Completely ignoring Trent's frantic attempts to block me, I walked straight into the bright sunlight streaming through the massive living room windows. Holding the silver tray steady, I locked eyes with Marcus Thorn and didn't say a single word. Thorn turned his head away from the stonework of the fireplace, finally focusing his attention on the old, dirty stable hand standing in the center of the room. The polite corporate smile on his face vanished in a fraction of a second. Every single drop of blood drained completely from his cheeks, leaving him as white as a ghost. He took a violent step back, his expensive leather shoes scuffing loudly against the hardwood floor. His hands began to shake so violently that he dropped his heavy leather binder, scattering highly confidential financial printouts all over the custom rug. Eleanor Sterling gasped loudly at the sudden mess, but Thorne completely ignored the falling documents. His eyes, wide with sheer terror, were locked dead onto my face, recognizing the features hidden beneath the dirt and greasy canvas coveralls. "Boss?" Thorne whispered, his voice cracking with absolute shock and deep confusion. "Mr. Vance, what on earth is happening here? Why are you dressed like a stable hand in your own house?" The pure panic in the billionaire's voice echoed through the quiet estate, instantly freezing the air in the room. The wine glass Chloe was holding slipped from her fingers, shattering into a million pieces on the floor. Trent completely froze, his arms still pointing toward the hallway. His head darted back and forth between my calm, dirty face and the prominent billionaire across the room, the exact man he had spent months desperately trying to impress, who was now looking on in absolute horror. The grand illusion of his wealth and power shattered into dust in a single second, leaving him completely exposed and utterly defenseless. Following Marcus Thorne's panicked words, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room, thicker than solid concrete. The only sound left in the world was the autumn wind howling against the massive glass windows of the estate. Eleanor Sterling sat frozen on the expensive leather sofa, her mouth open and her hand tightly gripping her own throat in absolute shock. The arrogant sneer she had been wearing since the second she arrived at my property had vanished, replaced by a pure, unadulterated terror. Chloe stared down at the shattered crystal wine glass on the hardwood floor, completely paralyzed as the fake reality she had carefully built catastrophically caved in around her. Her mind couldn't even process how the father she had just dismissed as a useless burden could command the absolute deference of a Wall Street titan. But it was Trent's face that told the entire story of his downfall. The confident, untouchable mask he had worn for years melted away in a single devastating second. Every single drop of blood drained from his cheeks, leaving him a sickly pale gray. His jaw trembled violently as his eyes darted frantically between my face and the billionaire, who was now staring at him with complete professional disgust. He was desperately trying to calculate the impossible math of how the helpless, senile old man he had locked in a freezing cold tack room was being addressed as boss by the most powerful financial force in the state. The entire foundation of his fake rich life was turning to dust, right under his expensive loafers, and he was completely powerless to stop it. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out, leaving him gasping like a fish out of water. I slowly set the silver tray down on the coffee table, the sharp clink of the porcelain cups sounding like a judge hammering down a final gavel. I raised my hands, systematically peeling off the dirty canvas work gloves and tossing them carelessly onto the pristine glass table, right next to Trent's expensive leather briefcase. Wiping away the dark soil from my cheeks with a clean handkerchief from my pocket, I stood completely straight, reclaiming my intimidating natural posture. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to scream to command the room. Real power never needs to roar. I reached deep into the inside pocket of my heavy coveralls and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I dropped it on the glass table directly in front of Marcus Thorne. The heavy thud of the paper made Trent flinch violently, as if he had just been slapped across the face. "Open it, Marcus," I ordered, my voice cold, calm, and absolute. "Tell this young man exactly whose money he was trying to borrow today." With hands that were still visibly shaking, Marcus Thorne reached out and opened the envelope. He pulled out the thick stack of documents, the ironclad evidence I had meticulously downloaded from my hidden servers. The first page was the forged power of attorney, clearly displaying my copied signature. The second page was the fraudulent $5 million commercial loan application Trent had frantically submitted to Thorne Vanguard Capital just hours ago. And the third page, the most lethal of them all, was the fake medical diagnosis signed by the corrupt doctor Julian Croft, claiming I was suffering from advanced Lewy body dementia. Thorne scanned the documents, his eyes widening with pure horror as he recognized the blatant criminal fraud staring back at him. He turned his gaze to Trent, his expression one of unbridled professional fury. "You submitted a commercial loan application leveraging stolen collateral," Thorne stated, his voice rising with a cold corporate rage. "You used forged medical documentation to bypass a majority stakeholder's authorization and strip him of his civil rights. This isn't just a bad investment play, Trent. This is major federal wire fraud. You are actively trying to steal $5 million from this fund." I took a slow, deliberate step toward my son-in-law, watching him shrink back in absolute terror. "Did you honestly think you could use my own property to defraud my own investment firm?" I asked, my voice echoing off the high wooden ceilings. "Did you genuinely believe you were clever enough to pull off a multi-million-dollar heist right in front of the man who built the entire financial infrastructure you're standing on? You're nothing but a pathetic little thief in a suit bought on maxed-out credit cards." Trent had shown complete and total ignorance of the complex financial networks that kept his fragile world spinning. When he desperately sent that loan application to Thorne Vanguard Capital, he thought he was tapping into a faceless corporate reserve run by distant bank executives. He had absolutely no idea how large-scale capital deployment actually worked at the elite tier of commercial real estate. Thorne's fund was primarily a public vehicle used to deploy and multiply the massive cash reserves generated by Vance Forensics and Auditing Group. The $5 million Trent was begging for wasn't standard bank capital, and it wasn't a collective investor pool. It was my personal liquidity. It was the capital I had personally accumulated over decades of exposing Wall Street, corporate corruption, and auditing offshore assets. If his fraudulent loan had somehow been miraculously approved, the money entering his bankrupt startup would have been drawn directly from my private corporate trust vaults. He was quite literally attempting to rob my private vault to pay off his bad leveraged bets, while stealing the very house I lived in to use as collateral for the robbery. The pure mathematical irony of his crime was beautiful in its absolute stupidity. For years he had looked down on me because of my age and my quiet, unpretentious demeanor. He had no idea that in the very financial ecosystem he was struggling to survive in, I was the silent apex predator. He thought he was hunting a weak, wounded animal, but he had willingly walked straight into the lion's mouth. He thought his fancy college degree and country club memberships made him a genius, but he was just a reckless, arrogant boy playing a dangerous adult game of chess without having a single clue how the pieces actually moved. The crushing reality of his absolute failure finally snapped the last remaining string of sanity in Trent's mind. He looked down at the lethal documents scattered across the glass table, detailing his federal crimes. He looked at the billionaire who was now staring at him with total professional contempt, ready to dismantle his career permanently. And then he looked at me, the man he had mocked, humiliated, and tried to lock away in a psychiatric ward just to steal a weekend party venue. The brutal reality of facing decades in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud, elder abuse, and identity theft hit him like a physical blow. His breathing became incredibly fast and shallow, his chest heaving underneath his tight designer shirt. A raw, desperate panic took over his face, erasing every last bit of his arrogant charm. The smooth tech bro son-in-law was dead, replaced by a cornered rat. He let out a ragged, guttural scream that sounded like a wild, injured animal caught in a trap. "Shut up!" he roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure violence and rage. "This is a lie. You're setting me up. This is all a fake setup by a crazy old man." Without a single second of warning, Trent completely lost his mind. 他蒙地不过咖啡桌，一脚踢翻了银质托盘，滚烫的茶水四处飞溅。他把厚重的玻璃桌面整个从木质地坐上掀翻，摔成了1000块碎片。他把整个身体的重量直接向我砸来，双手像绝望的爪子一样张开，直喷我的喉咙。His only thought in that moment was to silence me permanently, to grab those documents and tear them to shreds before anyone else could see them. He was completely past the point of caring about committing aggravated physical assault, right in front of a major financial witness, all to destroy the proof of his massive failure. The physical attack was sudden, aggressive, and entirely unhinged. The illusion of the sophisticated business executive was dead and buried, leaving behind nothing but a violent, terrified criminal fighting for his miserable life. As Trent lunged across the shattered glass of the coffee table toward me, his face a mask of pure, uncontrolled violence, I didn't flinch. I didn't even take a step back. Before his manic, manicured fingers could even touch the collar of my heavy canvas coveralls, a massive blur intercepted him mid-air. Marcus Thorne was not the kind of man who traveled to a remote estate to negotiate millions of dollars without top-tier executive protection. His private bodyguard, a man built like a solid brick wall, moved from the shadows of the hallway with a terrifying, practiced speed. He caught Trent by the shoulder and throat, perfectly using the younger man's own chaotic momentum against him. With a brutal twist, the bodyguard slammed Trent face first onto the hardwood floor. The impact was sickeningly loud, a solid, heavy thud that completely knocked the wind out of Trent's lungs. Trent groaned in agony, pinned completely flat under the heavy knee of the bodyguard, the shoulder seams of his expensive suit splitting open instantly under the pressure. Eleanor Sterling finally found her voice, letting out a piercing, hysterical shriek that echoed off the vaulted wooden ceilings as she clutched her expensive pearl necklace in pure terror. "Get your filthy hands off my son!" she shrieked, her face a mask of pure, indignant fury. "You are assaulting him. He is the legal owner of this estate. He doesn't own so much as a single splinter of this property," a new razor-sharp voice announced from the front entrance with absolute authority. The heavy mahogany doors were thrown wide open, and my personal attorney, Marcus Vance, who shares the agent's last name and serves as my nephew and chief legal counsel, walked in. He was a ruthless legal predator who wore his tailored three-piece suit like a suit of medieval armor. He marched into the chaotic living room with absolute unshakable confidence, carrying a heavy leather briefcase loaded with what was about to be a legal death sentence for the entire Sterling family. 2 armed private security contractors followed right behind him, taking up strategic positions at the exit with their hands resting casually on their tactical belts. Eleanor took a sharp step back, her aggressive screaming catching in her throat as she realized the power dynamics had just violently shifted against them. "Who on earth are you?" Arthur Sterling demanded, trying to puff out his chest and force the authority of a wealthy patriarch. though his voice trembled with uncertainty. My attorney didn't even look at Arthur, completely refusing to grant him that dignity. He walked straight into the center of the room, carefully stepping over the shattered glass of the coffee table, and looked down at Trent, who was still pinned flat to the floor, gasping for air like a fish out of water. "I am the chief legal counsel for Vance Forensics and Auditing Group," he stated, his voice carrying the deadly precision of a sniper rifle. "And as of exactly 9 o'clock this morning, the fraudulent power of attorney you forced my client to sign while under heavy medical sedation has been legally and permanently revoked by a federal judge." The attorney snapped open his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of court-stamped documents, and tossed them right next to Trent's face. "Furthermore, Mr. Sterling, an emergency injunction has been put into effect based on the overwhelming digital evidence of active interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and attempted financial extortion submitted to federal authorities earlier today. As we speak this very second, every single bank account, investment portfolio, and line of credit bearing your name, your wife's name, or the name of your failing corporation has been completely frozen by the SEC." Trent's eyes widened with an absolute suffocating terror. The remaining air in the room felt like it had been instantly sucked out. You can't do this," Trent choked out, making a useless struggle under the bodyguard's massive weight. "My company, my accounts, you're ruining me." The attorney gave a cold, predatory smile. "You ruined yourself, Trent. The banks are currently reversing every single transaction you attempted to authorize, using Mr. Vance's stolen collateral. You have absolutely zero liquidity right now. You can't withdraw a single dime to pay your private creditors, your high-end caterers, or the elite criminal defense attorneys you are going to desperately need to hire before the end of the afternoon." While Trent and Chloe genuinely believed that locking a 72-year-old man out in an unheated, dusty old tack room was some kind of punishment, they had actually handed me the ultimate undisturbed sanctuary to plan their complete financial demise without a single distraction. For the past 48 hours, while they were drinking my vintage wine and partying on my deck, I was in constant communication with my attorney over encrypted lines. I transmitted the forged signatures, the fake medical reports, and the illegal loan applications directly to his highly secure legal servers in D.C. My attorney didn't just file standard legal motions. He mobilized his massive, carefully cultivated network of federal judges and aggressive banking regulators to ensure that emergency asset freezes were executed immediately. It was a highly complex legal process that normally took weeks to push through, but we did it in a matter of hours because of the massive scale of the fraud we documented and the absolute clarity of the evidence chain. We built a legal cage that left absolutely no room for escape, reinforcing every single bar with the irrefutable digital evidence salvaged from Trent's own unguarded hard drive. I learned an iron rule over my decades of investigating offshore financial fraud. Never launch your strike until you have completely cut off your opponent's supply lines and escape routes. I didn't just want Trent's loan application to fail. I wanted to make sure he couldn't even buy a cheap cup of coffee to wash down the bitter taste of his absolute failure. While he thought he was winning, I was actually starving his fraudulent business out from the freezing cold, sitting on a pile of flattened cardboard boxes, operating a recycled server. He severely underestimated my patience, and more importantly, he fundamentally misunderstood my capacity for cold, methodical retribution. I'm a man who spent his life dismantling financial empires. I knew exactly how to destroy a fragile foundation with explosive precision. Chloe, who had been in a state of catatonic shock since the destruction of the expensive sofa, finally broke down completely. Her knees hit the hardwood floor hard, landing right in the middle of the scattered shards of broken glass. But she didn't even seem to notice the sharp edges cutting through her skin. The crushing reality of their absolute ruin finally caved through her thick skull. She looked at her husband pinned to the floor like a common criminal, and then looked up at me. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her expensive makeup and dripping onto her designer clothes. Dad, please, she sobbed, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate whine that echoed through the quiet room. Please stop this. We'll leave. We'll give the house back. Just tell your lawyer to unfreeze our accounts. I'm going to lose everything. My house, my car, my whole life. Please, I'm your daughter. I'm your little girl. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely zero warmth, zero pity, and zero remaining parental instinct. The daughter Clara and I raised died the exact second she handed that forged document to me while I was trapped in a hospital bed. You stopped being my daughter the moment you decided my life's work was an acceptable sacrifice for your social status, I said, my voice completely stripped of emotion, as cold as the wind sweeping through the Virginia Valley. I turned my gaze to my attorney. Pull out the updated final. Will we finalize this morning? Read the beneficiary clause to her. The attorney drew a fresh, crisp document from his briefcase and cleared his throat loudly. Chloe looked up, a completely new, distinct terror flashing in her eyes. By the legal instruction of Mr. Victor Vance, the attorney read, his voice ringing clearly through the room, Chloe Sterling is hereby permanently disinherited and officially stripped of all claims to any assets, trusts, or capital. Full ownership of the entire estate will be transferred unconditionally to the National Veterans and Orphans Foundation immediately upon Mr. Vance's passing. Chloe let out a gut-wrenching wail. The financial execution was officially complete. The sheer finality of my words hung heavily in the air. But Eleanor Sterling still refused to accept her absolute defeat. She was a woman who had spent her entire life weaponizing her social status, used to making the world bend to her will, assuming everyone else would just bow down and comply. She looked at Trent pinned flat to the floor by the bodyguard, and then turned a vicious, hateful glare toward me. She reached into her expensive designer bag and pulled out a gold-plated smartphone. Her hand shook uncontrollably, but her extreme arrogance was still fully intact. With an aggressive force, she punched 3 digits into the glowing screen, 911, and pressed the phone to her ear. She immediately demanded emergency assistance, screaming into the receiver with a calculated hysteria. She told the operator that she was currently at a luxury equestrian estate, where her family was being held hostage by a violent, mentally unhinged old man. She fabricated a complete story, claiming that I had hired heavily armed thugs to assault her successful son, and was currently attempting to extort them for millions of dollars. She demanded they send a massive police force immediately before I killed them all. She slammed the phone down and pointed a perfectly manicured nail straight at my face. She hissed triumphantly, telling me that I was going to spend the rest of my miserable life in a tiny concrete cell. She proudly announced that the police were coming to drag me away like a mad dog, and that my pathetic plan to ruin them had just permanently backfired. I didn't move a single muscle to stop her from making that frantic emergency call. I just stood there with my hands resting comfortably in the pockets of my canvas coveralls, watching her fully commit to her own grand delusion. The attorney let out a dry, humorless chuckle, checking his expensive silver watch, while the private security contractors remained perfectly still at the exit, completely unfazed by her dramatic threats. Chloe was still weeping on the floor, but she looked up with a pathetic, sudden flash of hope in her eyes, genuinely believing her powerful mother-in-law had just saved the day. The tense, suffocating silence in the room was finally broken. In the distance, the unmistakable heavy wail of police sirens began echoing up the winding gravel driveway. The sound multiplied, growing louder and more aggressive. A convoy of heavy vehicles was charging up the private corporate road I had explicitly left wide open for them. Flashing red and blue lights reflected against the living room walls, creating a chaotic disco effect of impending justice. Heavy tactical boots pounded against the wooden porch, and the front door was thrown completely open. A handful of heavily built men strode into the room, but they weren't wearing the standard blue uniforms of the local sheriff's department. They were clad in dark tactical gear over heavy body armor, with big yellow block letters aggressively printed across their chests. FBI, white-collar crime and SEC enforcement. Eleanor instantly rushed forward, pointing a finger directly at my chest, with an arrogant, triumphant smirk. In a shrill, commanding voice, she demanded that they arrest me on the spot. She insisted that I had organized a violent assault against her innocent son and was currently attempting a massive financial extortion. She ordered them to put me in handcuffs immediately and get me out of her house. Eleanor Sterling had absolutely no clue that the frantic emergency call she had placed to the local county dispatch was completely pointless. The heavily armed personnel storming into my living room weren't local cops arriving to answer a distress call from a wealthy, upset lady. They were elite federal agents. When I sat in that freezing cold, dusty tack room and clicked send on that highly encrypted email, I wasn't just filing a standard tip on a public hotline. I had transmitted a comprehensive, flawless digital dossier directly to FBI agent Marcus Sanders. As mentioned before, he was my old partner, whom I had secretly provided with the critical financial blueprints to destroy a massive money laundering network that had completely drained an entire city's treasury years ago. He owed me a massive favor, and I had just handed him the most defining, promotion-worthy case of his career on a silver platter. The digital package I sent contained Trent's forged power of attorney, the fake medical diagnosis signed by that corrupt doctor, and a massive paper trail of illegal wire transfers crossing multiple state lines. The exact second Agent Sanders opened that file, he secured a federal arrest warrant from a federal judge, completely bypassing the local jurisdiction. He had mobilized his tactical squad, hours before Eleanor ever thought about picking up her gold-plated smartphone to play the victim. Her frantic phone call merely provided a hilarious bit of dramatic irony to a federal raid executed with military precision. She thought her privilege was an untouchable shield, but she was really standing right in the middle of the tracks of a federal freight train that I had personally set in motion. The lead federal agent completely ignored Eleanor's aggressive pointing and her shrill, hysterical demands. He didn't even glance in my direction. He walked right past her with heavy, deliberate steps, roughly shoving her expensive silk shoulder out of the way as if she were just an annoying piece of furniture blocking his path. Eleanor gasped at the sheer disrespect, dropping her arm in absolute shock as she watched the tactical agent head straight into the center of the shattered coffee table. The massive bodyguard took a step back, releasing his brutal physical hold on Trent. Trent was gasping for air, pushing himself up on his hands and knees. His expensive custom suit was completely ruined, his face covered in black dust and sharp glass shards. He looked up at the towering federal agent, fully expecting to be rescued from this humiliating mess and to hand back his stolen authority. Instead, the agent reached behind his tactical belt and pulled out a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs. The loud metallic clink cut through the quiet room, snapping all the tension. In a booming baritone voice that left absolutely zero room for negotiation or argument, the agent announced Trent's full name. He explicitly declared that Trent was under federal arrest for massive interstate wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, securities violations involving a Ponzi scheme, and multiple counts of forgery. He informed Trent that he had the right to remain silent and strongly advised him to use it. The agent roughly grabbed Trent's arms, forcing them behind his back, and with a sharp click, the freezing cold steel locked around his wrists. Eleanor let out a piercing shriek, finally realizing the authorities weren't there to save her family, but to drag her precious son away to a federal prison. The final curtain had officially fallen on their grand illusion. The elite federal agents hauled Trent up from the glass-covered living room floor and roughly dragged him toward the front doors. His incredibly expensive custom suit hung off his shoulders like a dirty, discarded rag, completely destroyed in the struggle. He stumbled blindly, dragging his feet, all of his arrogant swagger and fake bravado completely drained from his body. This grand Sterling family merger party had turned into an active, chaotic federal crime scene right before their eyes. The 25 entitled guests who had been demanding high-end catering and vintage wine an hour ago were now in a state of pure absolute panic. They grabbed their expensive coats and fled the estate like desperate rats escaping a sinking ship, terrified of being tied to a major federal fraud investigation. Eleanor ran out onto the wooden porch behind the tactical agents, weeping loudly and frantically clawing at her perfectly styled hair. She begged the federal agents to let her precious son go, completely ignoring the massive reality of his multi-million-dollar theft. The bright, flashing red and blue lights of the tactical vehicles lit up the dark valley, casting long, jagged shadows across the crushed gravel driveway. Trent was dumped unceremoniously into the back of a heavily armored federal transport vehicle. The thick, solid steel doors slammed shut with a sound of absolute finality that echoed through the trees. Arthur Sterling watched his only son get locked away inside that dark federal vehicle, his face turning a blotchy, furious shade of purple. He finally broke his cowardly, shocked silence and marched aggressively up to the lead federal agent. He yanked a thick leather checkbook out of his breast pocket, desperately trying to force the fake authority of a wealthy, untouchable patriarch. He was trying to buy his way out, assuming his money could fix any catastrophic legal situation. He demanded to know the exact bail amount, insisting that he would write a massive corporate check right there on the hood of the tactical vehicle to secure Trent's immediate release. He yelled frantically that his family kept powerful, retained legal counsel, and that this violent raid was nothing but a massive misunderstanding that would be easily resolved by tomorrow morning. My private attorney, Marcus, stepped out onto the porch and let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut sharply through the crisp autumn night air. He slowly walked down the wooden steps, adjusting his tailored vest, and stood directly in front of the sweating, screaming man. Marcus informed him with a razor-sharp, predatory smile that federal wire fraud, severe securities violations, and identity theft didn't come with curbside bail services. He told Arthur to put his completely useless checkbook away, because the high-quality paper it was printed on was currently worth more than the total assets of his entire corporate entity. Marcus proudly revealed that the emergency federal injunction I had triggered earlier that morning hadn't just targeted Trent's personal bank accounts, because Arthur had stupidly co-signed several early commercial loan guarantees for Trent's failing startup fund. His own corporate holding accounts were now deeply and permanently entangled in the massive federal fraud investigation. Marcus announced loudly that the Federal Banking Commission had completely frozen every single asset, investment, and line of credit bearing the Sterling name. Arthur stared at the lawyer, his hand shaking so violently that his expensive solid gold pen slipped from his fingers and dropped straight into the dirt. He stuttered uncontrollably, insisting that his old family trust company was completely separate and legally untouchable. Marcus stepped in close, informing him that the federal banks had already initiated aggressive clawback procedures to recover all stolen capital. Arthur had absolutely zero liquidity left under his name anywhere in the world. He couldn't bail out his criminal son. He couldn't hire high-priced federal criminal defense attorneys. He couldn't even afford to pay for a cheap motel room for his family tonight. The massive financial fortress the Sterling family had used to bully and intimidate the world for decades had been completely and utterly leveled to the ground. When I sat in that freezing cold, dusty tack room sorting through the digital files, salvaged from Trent's completely unprotected hard drive, I didn't just limit my focus to his clumsy attempt to steal my horse farm. I had spent most of my life auditing massive commercial real estate empires and handling multi-billion-dollar books. I knew exactly how to track a toxic financial route back to its hidden source. I quickly discovered that Arthur's supposedly highly successful family trust was nothing but a fragile, hollow shell kept alive entirely by toxic, fraudulent loans generated by Trent's failing crypto fund. They had been constantly bouncing fake money back and forth between personal and corporate accounts to create the absolute illusion of massive generational wealth. They genuinely believed they were brilliant financial masterminds playing a high level shell game that nobody would ever notice. I knew that simply blocking Trent from stealing my property would be a temporary, minor victory. Eventually, they would rebuild and find another vulnerable target to exploit, continuing their parasitic lifestyle. I decided to initiate a full scorched earth legal protocol to ensure they could never harm another soul. By meticulously mapping out their deeply entangled banking structures and handing that precise digital roadmap directly to the highest federal authorities, I ensured that the resulting asset freezes would spread through their entire financial ecosystem like a lethal virus. I didn't just chop off an annoying branch of their toxic family tree. I poisoned the deepest roots and salted the earth, making sure absolutely nothing would ever grow there again. They had looked at my accent, my age, and my quiet, unpretentious demeanor, and assumed I was too ignorant to understand their sophisticated white-collar crime. They had absolutely no idea that I was the exact undercover auditor who had originally helped design the federal banking security protocols they had so stupidly and arrogantly tried to bypass. Arthur fell to his knees on the crushed gravel, completely broken by the sudden, violent evaporation of his entire fake empire. Eleanor stopped her shrill wailing, sinking into a state of absolute, horrified disbelief as she stared down at her defeated husband. It finally clicked that she was now thoroughly penniless and completely homeless. The massive scale of their sudden ruin was absolute, but my highly calculated retribution was not entirely finished. Before the heavy federal transport carrying Trent could even begin to pull out of the winding driveway, a massive familiar engine roar echoed aggressively up the dark mountain road. The heavy rubber tires of a massive flatbed tow truck ground against the gravel, driving straight toward the lit-up estate. Parked safely and securely right behind the heavy truck was Clara's pristine, spotless, British racing green 1961 Jaguar E-Type, gleaming beautifully under the flashing lights of the tactical vehicles. A local sheriff's cruiser followed tight behind the flatbed, its red and blue lights slicing through the dark night. The greasy buyer who had attempted to steal my late wife's prized vehicle was sitting in the back seat, locked in heavy steel handcuffs. The lead federal agent walked over to the local deputy. The deputy quickly explained that the sleazy buyer had flipped immediately, confessing that he had purchased a stolen vehicle across state lines using the completely fraudulent ownership documents provided directly by Trent Sterling. The federal agent nodded with a cold, highly satisfied smile. He reached into his tactical vest and pulled out a second folded search and arrest warrant. He walked over to the armored transport vehicle, slid open the small metal viewing window, and looked straight at Trent's terrified, bruised face. The agent informed Trent in a loud voice that grand theft auto and interstate transportation of high-value stolen property had just been officially added to his rapidly growing list of active federal felony charges. Trent buried his face deep into his handcuffed hands. He sobbed uncontrollably in the darkness as the inescapable physical weight of facing decades in prison finally crushed his arrogant soul completely. The flashing red and blue tactical lights eventually faded away down the dark, winding mountain road, leaving the massive custom estate in a heavy, suffocating dead silence. Chloe stood completely alone in the center of the ruined living room, surrounded entirely by the sharp, scattered shards of the destroyed coffee table. The massive, arrogant crowd of party guests had vanished without a trace, leaving nothing but the bitter debris of their ruined celebration scattered all over the floor. Eleanor and Arthur Sterling, after watching their only son get hauled away in an armored federal transport and seeing their entire financial empire violently evaporate, turned their venomous attention directly onto the only target they had left. A freezing mountain wind cut through the open front doors, causing the temperature in the room to plummet. Eleanor paced back and forth, her high heels tapping aggressively against the wood floorboards. She looked like a cornered animal, desperate to lash out at anyone nearby. She marched aggressively toward Chloe, her face twisting into a hideous mask of pure malicious hatred. Pointing a violently shaking finger straight into my daughter's pale face, she began screaming in an absolute frantic rage. She blamed Chloe for absolutely everything, calling her a useless, pathetic curse who had dragged their perfect, wealthy family down into the dirt. Arthur joined in on the brutal verbal assault, spitting out vicious insults and announcing loudly that bringing her into their elite family was the single biggest mistake his son had ever made in his life. The exact second their fake wealth vanished, they completely abandoned their so called sweet daughter in law, exposing the true, cold blooded nature beneath their masks. Chloe stood there shaking violently, taking the vicious verbal abuse from the exact people she had spent her entire adult life desperately trying to please. It finally caved in on her that the elite high society family she had sold her soul to be a part of viewed her as nothing more than a convenient, disposable scapegoat. When Eleanor aggressively raised her hand as if she was going to physically slap her across the face, Chloe finally broke down completely. She spun around frantically, dropping hard onto her knees on the hardwood floor, completely ignoring the sharp shards of glass cutting deep through her expensive designer jeans. She began crawling frantically across the ruined living room floor toward where I was standing near the heavy wooden door. Reaching out with violently trembling hands, she gripped my heavy work boots tightly, burying her tear-streaked face right into the stiff fabric of my canvas coveralls. "Dad, please save me," she wept desperately, hoping I would act as the shield that would protect her from the storm, just like I had for the past 30 years. But the man who would have done that died the exact second he saw his own signature meticulously forged on those stolen legal documents in that hospital bed. I didn't lean down to soothe her shaking shoulders. I didn't offer her a single word of fatherly comfort. Keeping my hands shoved firmly into my pockets, I maintained an absolute, rigid, sculptural stillness. I looked over at Marcus, who was silently observing the pathetic display with a cold, clinical detachment. I slowly and deliberately pulled my heavy work boots out of her desperate, gripping hands, taking a firm, steady step backward. "You made your choice, Chloe," I stated, my voice cutting cold and clear through the empty, high-ceilinged room. "You eagerly abandoned the father who built your entire life from scratch, just to desperately please a pack of toxic, fake-rich snobs." I told her she had sold her soul for a cheap illusion of vanity, and now she had to pay the massive outstanding bill. She gasped for air, choking on her own tears, completely unable to form a coherent response to my freezing rejection. "You only come begging for my ultimate protection now because your new family is thoroughly bankrupt and facing decades in a federal prison. You don't get to hand them the matches to burn down everything I built and then run back to me for a safe haven." Staring down at her weeping, pathetic figure, my mind immediately flashed back to the freezing, dark storeroom from early this morning. I remembered the look of pure irritation and absolute disgust on her face when she walked through that heavy wooden door. She was holding that flimsy paper plate covered in cheap aluminum foil. She had handed me the cold, stiff scraps from her lavish breakfast and ordered me to stay hidden away like a dirty secret, so I wouldn't embarrass her in front of her terrible new in-laws. I remembered the countless nights I worked late auditing books just so I could buy her a custom dress for her high school prom. I remembered the massive pride I felt when she graduated from the Ivy League with zero debt, because I paid every single massive tuition bill in cash. All those years of absolute devotion meant nothing to her when faced with the fake, shiny wealth of the Sterling family. She threw my entire legacy away like trash just to fit in with people who fundamentally despised her. She knew exactly that her arrogant husband was actively trying to steal my home, my hard-earned money, and my personal freedom. Yet all she cared about was maintaining her fake, elite social status. True forgiveness requires genuine remorse, born out of a fundamental recognition of the terrible, deep harm caused to an innocent victim. Chloe wasn't weeping on my floor because she realized she had deeply and unforgivably betrayed her father. She was crying simply because her fraudulent, luxurious lifestyle had spectacularly exploded right in front of her eyes, and she was suddenly forced to face the brutal, uncompromising consequences of her own terrible, selfish behavior. If Trent had successfully secured that $5 million fraudulent loan and locked me away in a secure psychiatric facility, Chloe would be sitting up on my deck right now, happily drinking vintage wine, completely unbothered by my permanent, devastating disappearance. She would have spent my hard earned money without a single hint of guilt, understanding that brutal, cold reality completely severed the final remaining thread of my parental obligation. A toxic, greedy parasite doesn't get to crawl back into a warm shelter simply because the hosts they tried to kill managed to fight back and win the battle. I spent my life being a reliable, solid provider, but I absolutely refused to be a convenient, disposable safety net for a greedy, ungrateful traitor. She had sold out my life for a pair of designer shoes. Chloe remained curled up pathetically on the floor, sobbing heavily into her hands, while Arthur and Eleanor continued to glare at her with absolute, undisguised disgust. Before I could instruct my private security team to physically remove the remaining hostile members of the Sterling family from my private property, the heavy wooden front door swung open again with a solid thud. The lead federal tactical agent from the White Collar Crime Division walked back into the room. His heavy tactical boots crunched sharply against the broken glass scattered on the rug. Completely ignoring the furious glares of the elder Sterlings, he walked straight toward my daughter with a deliberate, aggressive purpose. Chloe slowly raised her tear-streaked face, looking up at the towering federal officer with absolute, blind panic in her eyes. The agent reached into the front pocket of his heavy tactical vest and pulled out a thick legal document sealed inside a sturdy brown manila envelope. He reached down and tossed it unceremoniously onto the hardwood floor, right next to her trembling, bloodied hands. "Chloe Sterling," he announced, his booming baritone voice cutting sharply through her pathetic sobbing. "You are hereby officially served with a federal grand jury subpoena and an immediate summons. You are being formally charged as a fully cooperative co-conspirator in multiple counts of grand interstate wire fraud and aggravated bank fraud. Your personal signature appears undeniably on several fraudulent commercial loan applications. You are legally ordered to appear in federal court immediately to answer for these felony charges." The federal agent didn't offer a single ounce of sympathy to the weeping woman on the floor. He simply stated, in a completely businesslike manner, that failure to appear would result in an immediate federal warrant for her arrest. Eleanor and Arthur watched the scene unfold in a stunned, speechlessly horrified silence, finally realizing that the federal government was actively coming after absolutely everyone involved in this massive financial conspiracy. Chloe stared blankly at the thick brown envelope resting on the broken glass, as if it were a highly unstable explosive device. She realized perfectly that her entire life had been thoroughly and completely destroyed, with zero hope of repair. Chloe was completely trapped, with absolutely no way out, and no one left to save her from the inevitable ruin she had brought upon herself. 3 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse opened into a courtroom packed with eager reporters, aggressive federal prosecutors, and nervous onlookers. I sat in the front row wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, radiating the absolute unshakable strength of a man who had already won the war. Sitting across the polished central aisle was Trent Sterling, the arrogant, custom-suited CEO who had violently kicked open my front gates, was completely gone. In his place sat a gaunt, trembling shell of a man wearing an ill-fitting, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His expensive haircut had grown out into a messy, greasy weed. The deep, dark circles under his terrified eyes spoke volumes about the miserable time he had spent in federal lockup. He nervously shifted his chain legs underneath the heavy defense table, completely refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the gallery. Chloe sat 2 rows behind him, looking utterly exhausted, thoroughly isolated, and completely broken. Arthur and Eleanor Sterling hadn't even shown up. The exact second the bankruptcy liquidation proceedings began for their own corporate entities, they had cowardly fled the state. The federal judge entered the courtroom, his black robes billowing behind him as he immediately demanded absolute silence. The era of cheap manipulation, arrogant privilege, and hollow threats was officially over. Now, it was time for the final, undeniable execution of justice. The defense attorney, a high priced corporate shark who had undoubtedly taken a massive retainer, up front in untraceable cash, stood up and immediately began a pathetic, desperate performance. He paced in front of the jury box, trying to paint his client as a tragic, naive victim who had been brutally manipulated and actively set up by a vengeful, deeply biased father in law. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the defense attorney projected, his voice booming through the quiet room. Trent Sterling is not some criminal mastermind. He is a desperate young family man. He was ruthlessly manipulated and actively baited into a trap by an incredibly sophisticated, cold-blooded corporate predator. He turned dramatically, pointing an accusing finger straight at my chest. Victor Vance held a deep-seated personal hatred for his son-in-law. Using his massive hidden wealth and unseen corporate resources, he engineered a highly complex trap. He intentionally backed this young man into a corner of severe financial panic, simply to utterly destroy him for a personal vendetta. He claimed that I had intentionally hidden my true wealth, just to make Trent feel a management responsibility toward my estate. It was a ridiculous and deeply insulting defense strategy, but it was the only pathetic card they had left to play. Trent sat at the table, nodding frantically, trying to look like a broken martyr. Faced with this blatant public accusation, I didn't flinch or show even an ounce of anger. I just looked over at Marcus, my attorney, who was casually adjusting his silk tie with the amused look of an apex predator. Marcus stood up and addressed the judge with absolute clinical precision. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to spin a fictional narrative of a class setup to distract from the cold, hard, digital reality of a calculated federal fraud case. My client did not forge his own medical records. My client did not actively apply for a $5 million commercial loan under false pretenses. And my client certainly did not hold a gun to the defendant's head and force him to illegally sell a classic sports car to a known out-of-state criminal. Marcus walked over to the evidence table, picked up a thick stack of printed bank statements, and held them up for the entire jury to see. The defendant acted with complete malicious autonomy. His actions were driven entirely by his own reckless greed and a desperate desire to maintain a fake high society lifestyle. He willingly and aggressively targeted a man he believed was a helpless, senile elder. The defense attorney immediately objected, claiming the financial records were purely circumstantial, and aggressively demanded ironclad proof of Trent's direct, malicious intent. He arrogantly insisted that Trent genuinely believed he had the legal right to manage the estate and was simply trying to help a declining older man. The audacity of the lie hung heavily in the courtroom, but Marcus just flashed a terrifying, shark-like smile. He turned to the judge and formally requested permission to submit Government Exhibit 42 into the official record. I sat completely still as the court technicians set up the advanced audio equipment, thinking back on the relentless, exhausting work of the past 3 months. While Trent was rotting in a maximum security federal holding cell, desperately waiting for a bail hearing that was never going to come, I was working actively side by side with the FBI. I opened my corporate books completely and granted Agent Sanders absolute unrestricted access to my advanced security servers. We hadn't just built a standard criminal case. We meticulously constructed an unbreakable titanium vault of irrefutable evidence. We tracked every single fraudulent wire transfer, every bounced corporate check, and every forged signature, tracing them all directly back to the network address on Trent's personal encrypted devices. Using my extensive forensic network, I uncovered the dark web proxy servers he used to hire that corrupt doctor, Julian Croft, who had already taken a brutal plea deal to testify directly against Trent to save his own skin. We thoroughly dismantled his entire financial ecosystem, tracing the toxic debt all the way back to the exact moment he realized his crypto venture fund was collapsing. I spent countless hours sitting in sterile, brightly lit interrogation rooms, helping federal prosecutors connect the complex digital dots. I refuse to leave a single legal loophole or a shred of reasonable doubt for any high-priced defense attorney to exploit. The buyer, who had taken Clara's Jaguar, had flipped too, providing a written deposition proving that Trent had bragged to his face about stealing the car from his senile father-in-law. I made sure that when this specific day finally arrived, Trent would have absolutely nowhere to hide and no one to blame but his own toxic, overwhelming greed. The courtroom speakers crackled with electricity, sharply cutting through the tense, suffocating silence. Marcus hit play on his laptop, broadcasting the high-definition audio file I had secretly intercepted from the hidden microphones back in the freezing tack room. Trent's arrogant, aggressive voice boomed loudly through the wide federal courtroom, permanently destroying any illusion of his innocence. The recording captured the exact moment he had stormed into the tack room, demanding the master override codes, completely unaware that he was speaking directly into the microphone of a military-grade security network. "You are completely delusional," Trent's recorded voice sneered, dripping with venom and undeniable malice. "You're just making up fake corporate zoning laws because you're desperately trying to hold on to whatever pathetic little control you think you have left." The audio continued, capturing his raw, unedited admission of the entire plot. "I have the executed deed to this estate right here. I used the power of attorney Chloe had you signed in the hospital. You're just a broke, pathetic old psycho, and I'm taking everything." Trent sat at the defense table, completely paralyzed, the color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. He was listening to his own unique voice, actively mocking the man he tried to rob, openly bragging about how he had weaponized the forged documentation. The expensive defense attorney dropped his solid gold pen onto the wooden table. He realized in that exact second that his carefully crafted narrative had been instantly and permanently obliterated. The jury locked their eyes onto Trent with an absolute, unfiltered disgust. The federal judge, a stern, uncompromising man who held absolute zero tolerance for arrogant white-collar criminals, leaned forward and slammed his heavy wooden gavel down. The deafening crack tore through the courtroom like a gunshot, officially signaling the absolute inevitable end of Trent Sterling's entire life. The courtroom held its collective breath as the heavy wooden gavel struck the block one last time, the crisp sound echoing like a definitive period at the end of a long, violent sentence. The jury's deliberation had taken less than 3 hours, an incredibly short time that spoke volumes about the absolute, irrefutable clarity of the evidence we presented. Trent stood from the defense table, his chained hands shaking uncontrollably as the jury foreman stood to read the verdicts. The suffocating tension in the room was absolute. Even the aggressive federal prosecutors remained perfectly still, watching the final destruction of the arrogant business criminal. On 12 counts of interstate wire fraud, guilty. On 3 counts of aggravated identity theft, guilty. On charges of interstate transportation of stolen property and severe elder abuse, guilty. Each word landed like a physical blow directly to Trent's chest. His high-priced defense attorney stared blankly at his notes, thoroughly defeated by the staggering digital reality of his client's crimes. The federal judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, and looked down at Trent with pure, undisguised contempt. The time for pathetic excuses was officially over. "Trent Sterling," the judge began, his booming voice leaving absolutely no room for mercy or negotiation. "您积极地讲，您的商业只是无企划，策划了一场针对一个你认为处于弱势地位的男人的掠夺性、高度计算的阴谋。You forged legally binding medical documents and attempted to steal millions of dollars to fund your pathetic illusion of wealth. You are a severe danger to the financial ecosystem and a disgrace to society. I hereby sentence you to 120 months, 10 years, in a maximum security federal prison, with no possibility of parole." Trent let out a sharp, painful gasp, collapsing completely back into his heavy wooden chair. 10 years. By the time he breathed fresh air as a free man again, he'd be nearly 50 years old. His youth, his tech startup dreams, and his entire career were permanently erased. The judge didn't stop there. He officially ordered the immediate liquidation of all remaining Sterling corporate holding accounts to pay for the massive federal fines and restitution. The fake retail business empire that Arthur and Eleanor used to throw their weight around in DC high society was legally dismantled and auctioned off to the highest bidder for pennies on the dollar. Then the judge turned his harsh glare toward the gallery, locking his eyes dead onto Chloe, who was trembling in the second to last row. Chloe Sterling, he continued, his tone shifting from anger to a cold, businesslike delivery. Due to your extensive cooperation and testimony in the case against your husband, and clear evidence that you were actively manipulated into signing certain secondary loan documents, you are officially cleared of the primary federal conspiracy charges. You will not serve jail time. Chloe burst into dramatic, loud sobs of pure relief, burying her tear-streaked face in her hands. However, the judge raised his voice, cutting through her tears, you remain fully liable under the law for the joint financial accounts you willingly opened in your married name during the course of your marriage. This court has absolutely zero sympathy for your aggressive financial negligence. You are personally responsible for the remaining $800,000 in outstanding corporate credit card debt accumulated by your husband. This court orders you to begin mandatory repayment immediately. Failure to comply will result in aggressive wage garnishment and a total seizure of your assets. Chloe froze completely. That massive sob caught right in her throat. She had actively avoided a federal prison cell, but she was now chained to a massive, unpayable mountain of toxic debt. In a single devastating strike of the gavel, she lost her husband, her home, her fake elite status, and any hope for a normal financial future. When Chloe was eagerly signing those joint credit applications, she completely failed to understand the absolute brutality of American financial law. Back during the peak of their fake rich lifestyle, Trent easily convinced her to co-sign for those massive high-end corporate lines of credit, using her name to secure better interest rates and exclusive travel perks. She happily signed her legal name on those documents, completely blinded by the shiny illusion of seemingly limitless spending. She cheerfully swiped those black metal cards to buy designer bags, expensive European vacations, and lavish country club memberships without ever questioning where the money came from. She assumed money was just an infinite resource that came with her new last name. The federal legal system doesn't care about your hurt feelings or your sudden claims of extreme ignorance. Joint debt means joint and total liability. That $800,000 Trent spent to save his failing crypto portfolio and maintain their fake rich lifestyle was now sitting entirely on her shoulders. Because this massive debt was directly tied to federal fraud charges and criminal restitution mandates, it was completely excluded from standard bankruptcy protection. She couldn't simply file for Chapter 7 and walk away. That heavy $800,000 anchor would follow her ruthlessly for the rest of her life. It would actively drain every single future paycheck, utterly destroy her credit score, and ensure she could never own a home or secure a decent loan ever again. She had eagerly traded the solid, debt-free foundation I built for her just for a fleeting fake illusion of high society acceptance. Now she was completely enslaved by the very financial system she had so arrogantly tried to use to destroy her own father. The U.S. Marshals roughly escorted Trent out through the side doors, his heavy handcuffs and leg irons clanking loudly against the polished floor. He didn't look back at his wife. He didn't offer a final apology or a single word of comfort. He just kept his head down, staring dead at the floor. His 10-year nightmare had officially begun. The courtroom slowly emptied out, leaving Chloe sitting completely alone on the wooden bench, utterly crushed by the reality of her total ruin. I stood up, buttoned my custom suit jacket, and walked calmly down the center aisle, completely ignoring her faint, pathetic whimpering. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, and took a deep breath of the clean, crisp air. The intense legal war was finally over. An absolute victory belonged entirely to me. I walked down the wide concrete steps toward the street, where my private driver had already parked my black luxury sedan, the engine idling as he waited for me. As I reached the final step, I heard the frantic clicking of cheap high heels on the pavement behind me. Chloe had rushed out of the courthouse doors, her hair a total mess, and her eyes swollen red from crying. She had absolutely nothing left in this world. The Sterling family had abandoned her. Her husband was locked in a federal cage, and her bank accounts were permanently frozen by the government. She was thoroughly broke, completely homeless, and terrified of the future. She stood on the pavement, shivering in the chilly wind, staring desperately at my car. She slowly walked toward my sedan, her hands clamped tightly together in a pathetic, begging gesture, waiting for me to open the door and rescue her from the absolute wreckage of her own life. I walked up to the gleaming black door of the waiting sedan, the smooth metal reflecting the harsh afternoon sun cutting through the city skyline. My private driver stood ready, gripping the handle with professional precision, waiting to sweep me back to the quiet sanctuary of my mountain estate. Before I could even step into the comfort of the leather interior, the frantic click of cheap high heels on the hard concrete echoed loudly, shattering the peaceful rhythm of my departure. Chloe threw her exhausted body violently between me and the open door, her hands slapping flat against the tinted glass, as if she could physically stop me from leaving her behind. Her expensive designer clothes were wrinkled and heavily stained with tears. Her flawless makeup was completely ruined after hours of hysterical crying in the tense federal courtroom. She looked absolutely nothing like the arrogant, hyper-privileged woman who had strutted into my estate 3 months ago, demanding my immediate eviction. "Dad, please wait!" she hyperventilated, her voice raspy and broken into a desperate, pathetic scream that drew stares from passing pedestrians. "The federal bank seized the luxury condo this morning. I have absolutely zero money to my name, and I don't even know where I'm sleeping tonight. Please just let me come back to the estate with you. I promise I'll do whatever you want. I'll scrub the hardwoods, I'll cook for you, I'll earn my keep. Please, take me home." I stood completely straight on the busy city sidewalk, entirely unfazed by her dramatic public meltdown. Lawyers in suits and court officials glanced our way, but I didn't care about the scene she was making. I looked down at the weeping woman blocking my path, feeling absolutely zero parental urge to comfort her or solve the massive crisis she brought on herself. "That estate is my private residence, Chloe," I stated, my voice dangerously calm and stripped of all warmth. "It is not a homeless shelter for convicted federal fraud co-conspirators, and it is absolutely not a convenient backup plan for a traitor who actively tried to ruin my life." She let out a sharp, violent gasp, the tears running endlessly down her cheeks as she reached out and grabbed the tailored sleeve of my custom jacket. "Dad! Trent did all of this!" she shouted desperately, trying to shift the total weight of her guilt onto her imprisoned husband. "He lied to me and hid everything. He forged and manipulated my signature on those banking documents. I didn't know how sinister his real financial plans were. I just wanted us to be a successful, powerful family." I reached down and firmly removed her trembling hand from my suit, smoothing out the expensive fabric with a cold, clinical precision. "Don't come crawling here now to play the naive, innocent victim just to insult my intelligence," I shot back sharply, completely cutting through her pathetic wall of excuses. "You were the one standing in my freezing tack room, handing me cold leftover pancakes like you were feeding a stray dog. You were the one looking me dead in the eye, demanding that I sacrifice the property I worked my entire life for, just so your arrogant husband could pay off his massive, hidden, leveraged gambling debts. The only reason you think Trent is a dangerous criminal now is because he got caught, and you lost access to that dirty money. If he had successfully stolen my $5 million equity and locked me away in a secure psychiatric ward, at this exact second, you'd be happily spending my money and enjoying a designer vacation in Europe. You wouldn't have spent a single second thinking about my miserable existence inside that padded cell. Chloe shrank back against the sedan door as if I had physically slapped her across the face. She knew my assessment was absolutely, brutally accurate, and there was no denying it. But I'm your daughter, she whined, repeating the only meaningless card she had left in her desperate game. I'm your own flesh and blood. You can't just leave me out here to starve on the cold street. You're a father. You're supposed to protect me unconditionally. I stared at her tear-streaked face. My mind immediately drifted back exactly 5 years ago to a quiet, sterile hospital room. I had been sitting right by Clara's bedside, holding her weak, slender hand. That aggressive cancer was slowly and relentlessly taking her away from me. We both knew the end was coming, and in those final moments, we shared the ultimate honest truth. Clara had always possessed an incredibly sharp, penetrating intuition about people, especially about the deep flaws in our own daughter. She looked at me with those tired but beautiful eyes and gave me one final piece of critical advice. And I'd been foolish enough to ignore it until this defining moment. "Victor," she had whispered weakly, but her voice carried the immense weight of absolute certainty. "You always work too hard, wanting to give the world to Chloe. But you cannot simply buy someone a solid moral compass with money. She has been completely consumed by a desperate, endless need for superficial validation from people who don't even matter. When I am gone, do not let your deep grief turn you into a blind, financial enabler. Unconditional love never means endlessly funding someone's toxic greed, and family loyalty doesn't mean allowing yourself to be utterly ruined by your own flesh and blood. If she ever completely chooses the darkness and betrays our values, you must find the incredible strength to close that heavy door and leave her to face the freezing cold outside on her own." For the past 5 years, I had been desperately trying to avoid facing that brutal reality. I kept my head buried in the sand, throwing massive amounts of money at her problems, hoping she would finally mature into a decent human being. But Clara had been completely, thoroughly right. Chloe had fully surrendered to the toxic, superficial rot of the Sterling family. No amount of my blood money was ever going to miraculously fix her deeply corrupted character. She had crossed a fatal line where there was absolutely no turning back. I refocused my sharp attention on the broken woman, sobbing frantically on the concrete pavement. The blind clarity of Clara's final warning completely blocked out any emotional manipulation left in my heart. You eagerly chose a life of fake luxury and cruel deception over the father who loved you and raised you, I said, my voice carrying the absolute finality of a federal judge reading a permanent death sentence. You desperately wanted to play high-stakes business games with arrogant, financial predators. Now you must pay the ultimate devastating price for losing that game. Chloe dropped hard onto her knees on the dirty asphalt, her hands clamped tightly together in one final pathetic gesture of begging. "Dad, please? What am I supposed to do now?" she wailed, her voice echoing loudly between the towering concrete and steel buildings around us. I looked down at her, empty-handed and utterly ruined by her own massive greed. I vividly remembered the incredibly arrogant opening line Trent had used just 3 months ago when he kicked open my front gates and demanded I make space for his awful family. I also remembered the calm, simple phrase I shot back at him right before they launched this massive, catastrophic war against me. "Pack your bags, Chloe," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing, razor-sharp whisper. She looked up at me, completely and utterly confused. Her heavy tears paused for a fraction of a second. "But I don't have any bags left," she choked out, her voice trembling violently in the wind. "The Federal Bank literally took everything I owned." I gave her a single cold, absolutely merciless smile. I glanced down at her ruined designer leather shoes. "Then I strongly suggest you start walking," I replied, and with that, I turned my back forever. I stepped smoothly into the luxurious leather interior of my waiting sedan. My private driver immediately shut the heavy, solid door, sealing me safely inside my fortress. The thick tinted windows rolled up, completely muting her frantic, desperate screaming outside. The powerful engine roared to life. The massive vehicle pulled smoothly away from the curb and merged into the busy city traffic, leaving Chloe Sterling completely alone to rot on the cold, unforgiving concrete sidewalk. The long drive back up the winding mountain road to the estate was the most peaceful journey I had experienced in months. My private driver navigated the heavy luxury sedan smoothly around the sharp curves, leaving the toxic noise of the city and the aggression of the cold concrete far behind us. We passed through the security gates at the bottom, the exact fortified checkpoint where Trent had fallen into a complete mental breakdown trying to force his way through just weeks ago. The armed private security guards offered a deeply respectful, crisp nod as we rumbled slowly past their reinforced booth. The deep silence of the mountains welcomed me like an old friend as we pulled onto the long gravel driveway of my sprawling estate. The aggressive convoy of luxury SUVs and the entitled, rowdy Sterling family were completely gone, erased as if they had never existed. The heavy, lingering scent of cheap designer perfume and burnt high-end catering steak had been thoroughly washed away by the crisp, high-altitude autumn wind sweeping through the tall pine trees. I stepped out of the warm leather interior of the vehicle, standing completely alone on the smooth, pristine driveway. I looked up at the massive custom brick and timber estate. It stood tall and solid, completely unfazed by the pathetic, brief invasion it had recently endured. The massive oak beams and hand-carved stone chimneys radiated an absolute aura of permanence. This sanctuary was finally, officially, and completely mine again. The foul stench of those greedy parasites had been thoroughly eradicated from my sacred ground. I walked up the wide wooden steps and stepped onto the wraparound porch, my heavy work boots making a solid rhythmic thud against the thick treated wood. I stopped in front of the heavy double front doors, staring dead at the digitally glowing smart lock, the exact piece of junk Trent had arrogantly installed to lock me out of my own home in the freezing winter night. Its glowing red keypad felt like a sickening technological parasite, desperately clinging to the beautiful natural mahogany that I had personally selected, sanded, and varnished 20 years ago. I didn't even bother to input a master code to bypass his pathetic, fragile system. I walked around the perimeter of the deck, moved to the side of the house, and entered through the practical mudroom, heading straight for my heavy-duty toolbox. I grabbed a heavy, solid steel crowbar, a high-powered cordless drill, and a set of specialized metal extractors. Walking back out onto the front porch, I carried an absolute, freezing determination burning in my chest. I wedged the cold, solid steel tip of the crowbar directly underneath the cheap, plastic housing of Trent's so-called high-security smart lock. With a single, brutal, downward mechanical force, I yanked the bar. The expensive piece of tech trash let out a loud, cracking snap as it was violently ripped away from the wooden frame, exposing the cheap, bare internal wiring underneath. I threw the shattered digital garbage over the high wooden railing, letting it smash against the hard, packed dirt below, breaking into a dozen useless plastic pieces. It was an incredibly satisfying, violent, and physical cleansing, completely purging the final remnant of the Sterling infection from my property. Reaching deep into the bottom of my heavy canvas tool bag, I pulled out the original, solid brass mechanical deadbolt I had foolishly uninstalled years ago during a security upgrade. It was incredibly heavy and ice-cold to the touch. It was completely and utterly reliable, requiring a physical, solid key to manually turn the heavy internal steel tumblers. I spent the next hour meticulously reinstalling the solid brass mechanism, drilling long, heavy steel screws deep into the reinforced solid oak frame of the thick door. I turned the heavy metal key, feeling that incredibly satisfying, solid mechanical click as the thick deadbolt slid safely and permanently into place. No more flashing digital lights, no more vulnerable wireless networks open to hackers, and no more convenient digital access codes for arrogant, entitled thieves to manipulate from afar. It was a pure, impenetrable physical barrier. The only way anyone was ever crossing it was with my explicit physical permission. This house was officially and permanently locked down from the outside world. I walked into my private study. It was a quiet, climate controlled room, lined from floor to ceiling with heavy wooden bookshelves, packed with massive rolled architectural blueprints and financial archives from my long, incredibly successful career in corporate auditing. I sat down heavily at the wide, polished mahogany desk and snapped open my heavy leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick stack of fresh, legally binding documents that Marcus had meticulously prepared for me early this morning. These were the final, uncompromising execution papers for my sprawling private commercial estate. They officially, permanently, and forever stripped every single income-generating asset, property deed, and high-yield corporate trust away from Chloe's name. For my entire adult life, I had operated under the heavy, exhausting, completely suffocating weight of extreme parental financial obligation. I had tirelessly hoarded the massive wealth I accumulated, building an unbreakable financial fortress, strictly to ensure my daughter would never have to face the harsh, incredibly brutal economic struggles I endured growing up with absolutely nothing. I had genuinely believed that passing down this massive generational wealth was the ultimate undeniable expression of a devoted father's unconditional love. But as I signed my legal name in thick black ink on the final page of the official paperwork, permanently redirecting tens of millions of dollars as a donation to the National Veterans and Orphans Foundation, something incredible happened. I felt a massive, suffocating physical weight lift completely and utterly off my exhausted shoulders. I was finally undeniably free. I was no longer a convenient host for a greedy, ungrateful, toxic parasite who viewed my ultimate demise as her personal lottery ticket. The tens of millions of dollars I'd bled, sweated, and aggressively worked for would go directly toward funding full-ride college scholarships for brilliant, struggling young minds. They possessed the true, raw drive and solid moral character that my own flesh and blood daughter completely and utterly lacked. I was actively building a brand new, powerful legacy. A legacy rooted firmly in true academic merit and fierce, unyielding determination, rather than superficial, unearned privilege and toxic high society validation. I snapped the heavy leather binder shut, feeling a profound, absolute, and unbreakable sense of peace settle permanently over my tired soul. The late autumn sun began to dip slowly underneath the towering evergreen pine trees, casting long, deep, dark shadows across the sprawling, pristine estate. The temperature plummeted, cutting right through the fabric of my clothes, but I felt a thorough warmth inside myself, feeling completely and utterly alive. I left the comfort of the heated main house and walked slowly down the familiar, winding dirt path toward the freezing, detached storeroom, the exact place where I had meticulously engineered the total, catastrophic downfall of the entire Sterling family. The heavy wood door creaked open, revealing the dark, dusty, utilitarian interior. The makeshift, incredibly uncomfortable cardboard bed still sat pathetically in the far corner, surrounded by the heavy humming of the server racks and the false wooden security wall I had built. I began dismantling the flattened cardboard boxes, systematically gathering the old, heavy moving blankets. I intended to thoroughly and cleanly erase any remaining physical evidence of my brief, humiliating exile. As I lifted the heavy plastic storage bin to slide it back into its proper place, a square, heavy object slipped out from beneath the thick canvas tarp. It hit the hard, freezing concrete floor with a faint, metallic clink. I dropped slowly onto my knees, my joints letting out a slight crack in the cold air, and picked up the small, solid, sterling silver frame. It was the absolute only sentimental item I had managed to secretly smuggle into this freezing tack room when Trent aggressively locked me out in the cold. It was an old, faded, incredibly beautiful photograph of Clara. It was taken during our very first summer out on this mountain property, long before the massive main house was ever finished. She was smiling brilliantly at the camera, her natural curls flying wild and free in the mountain wind. She looked incredibly happy, at total and absolute peace with the world. Trent had carelessly and violently kicked this plastic bin during his volatile, destructive tantrums in the tack room, nearly shattering the fragile glass protecting her beautiful, smiling face. I wiped a thin layer of gray dust from the smooth, cold glass, staring deeply into the eyes of the woman who had so wisely warned me about the exact catastrophic disaster that had just unfolded. I pressed her preserved image tightly against my chest, suddenly feeling a fierce, overwhelming, and completely unexpected wave of profound emotion wash over me. The brutal, highly calculated financial and legal war was completely over. The aggressive, greedy enemies had been fully and utterly defeated. But a brand new, profound emotional truth was about to reveal itself completely to me in the absolute quiet of these sunset-drenched mountains. The early morning sun peeked over the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sprawling Virginia Valley in a brilliant cascade of deep orange and soft purple hues. The biting chill of the mountain air was crisp and incredibly invigorating, rushing into my lungs like a pure wave of absolute rebirth. I stood in my quiet, custom kitchen, listening to the slow, steady drip of the coffee maker as it filled my favorite heavy ceramic mug with pitch-black, dark roast coffee. The profound silence in the house was no longer heavy, and it was no longer suffocating. It was a beautiful, welcome companion now, a massive blank canvas that belonged completely and absolutely to me alone. I took the steaming mug and walked slowly out onto the wide wooden deck, sinking deeply into the heavy, solid wood rocking chair Clara and I had bought together over 2 decades ago. The old timber groaned slightly under my weight, a familiar, comforting sound that anchored me firmly to the present moment. I looked out over the miles of massive, unbroken natural landscape stretching out in every direction. I remembered the days I spent personally cutting timber and clearing the foundation for this deck, hammering every single nail and brace perfectly into place. The world was waking up, and nature seemed completely indifferent to the massive corporate wars and bitter human betrayals that had recently stained this sacred ground. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the bitter black coffee, feeling the piping hot liquid warm my chest cavity. The chaotic storm had completely passed, and the brand new dawn was absolutely flawless. The soft, gentle vibration of my phone on the small wooden side table mildly broke the deep, peaceful silence of the morning. I glanced at the glowing screen, seeing the securely encrypted number of my attorney, Marcus, flashing. I picked up, knowing that my ruthless lawyer rarely called this early unless he possessed a final, definitive update on our ongoing legal demolition project. Marcus greeted me in his usual crisp, businesslike tone, completely skipping any unnecessary small talk. He was calling to deliver the absolute final status report on the scattered ruins of the Sterling family empire. He informed me that the federal bankruptcy courts had officially seized the last remaining assets belonging to Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, the once arrogant, fake wealthy couple, the ones who had scoffed at my country estate and treated me like a low-level servant, had been violently evicted from their luxury D.C. penthouse. Marcus had tracked their financial footprint and confirmed they were currently renting a tiny, run-down ground-floor apartment in a notoriously dangerous, low-income neighborhood on the far east side of the city. Their leased luxury cars were repossessed, and their elite country club memberships were permanently terminated in a state of severe public disgrace. Marcus reported that Eleanor was now working as an entry-level customer service representative, forced to take abusive phone calls from angry retail consumers simply to pay for basic groceries. Then Marcus turned his clinical report toward the status of my former daughter. Due to the devastating, highly publicized federal fraud indictment hanging over her head, combined with her catastrophic credit score, Chloe had failed completely to secure any high-level corporate employment. Marcus reported with an immense amount of pride that his private investigators located her working the night shift at a massive low-cost discount supermarket, functioning as a basic cashier. She was forced to scan cheap, off-brand food items under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights, earning a measly minimum wage. Furthermore, 100% of her disposable income was being aggressively and automatically garnished by the federal government to pay off that massive $800,000 debt Trent had permanently anchored to her name. She was now taking public transit every single night back to a tiny, cheap room she shared with three loud strangers, living a life of absolute crushing poverty. She had to stand on her swollen feet for 10 hours a day, dealing with rude customers and abusive managers, completely stripped of the expensive designer clothes and the elite social circles she cherished. I listened to Marcus's entire highly detailed report without saying a single word. I didn't feel a sudden rush of vengeful joy, and I absolutely did not feel a single lingering drop of fatherly pity. I felt nothing but an absolute, perfectly balanced sense of cold, hard cosmic satisfaction. They had aggressively tried to steal the fruits of my entire life's hard work, and now they were being forced to swallow the bitter harvest of their own toxic greed. I thanked Marcus for his exceptional service, calmly ended the call, and placed the phone face down on the table. I leaned back into the solid wood rocking chair, staring out at the soft fog rolling slowly across the distant mountain lake. For my entire adult life, I had operated under a completely false assumption. I had believed that blood was an unbreakable, sacred bond that demanded endless sacrifice and deep, unconditional forgiveness. I had allowed my deep grief over losing Clara to blind me to the dark, undeniable reality of my daughter's toxic entitlement. I had thought a father's ultimate responsibility was to provide a massive, impenetrable financial shield to protect her from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the adult world. I worked 80 hours a week, navigating the most brutal forensic auditing cases, simply to ensure she would never know the painful sting of poverty that I grew up with. But I failed completely to realize something vital. If you constantly protect a person from the natural consequences of their own terrible behavior, you ultimately end up creating a monster. True family is never defined by shared genetics or a matching last name. True family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, deep and unwavering loyalty, and solid moral integrity. Letting go of Chloe's hand completely was undeniably the hardest physical and emotional task of my life, but it was also the most profoundly necessary action I have ever taken. Honoring my own legacy and protecting the sacred memory of my late wife was 10,000 times more important than maintaining a highly toxic relationship with a parasite who wore my daughter's face. The massive wealth I built was now safely transferred to the Vance Veterans Foundation, where it would fund the bright futures of brilliant, struggling young students who actually deserved a fighting chance. I had finally learned the ultimate, most brutal lesson of my later years. You can never buy true love, and you can never negotiate with greedy, heartless evil. The only thing you can do is cut the infection out completely and let the wound heal in the fresh, clean air. I stood up from the creaking rocking chair and walked over to the thick wooden railing, taking one final deep breath of the freezing cold mountain pine air. Leaving the empty ceramic coffee mug on the small side table, I walked down the wide wooden steps and followed the dirt path leading directly down to the private lake. I grabbed my old, worn fishing rod from the side of the house, feeling the familiar, rough cork handle fit perfectly into my palm. I walked slowly down the winding path, the early morning dew soaking the bottom edges of my heavy canvas coveralls and wetting my leather boots. I reached the long wooden dock stretching far out into the clear lake water. The surface of the lake was absolutely perfectly still, a massive, flawless mirror reflecting the towering green pine trees and the bright blue sky above. I checked the strong nylon fishing line and hooked a small, simple silver lure. With a smooth, practiced motion, I cast it far out into the cold, deep water. The tiny splash shattered the perfect reflection, sending out beautiful, concentric ripples across the surface. I stood on that wooden dock completely and utterly alone, feeling the solid, unshakable ground beneath my boots as the warm morning sun finally broke through the trees and hit my face. There were no more arrogant shouts demanding my attention, No more people trying to force me out of my own home, and no more fake smiles hiding malicious criminal intent. The massive corporate wars were permanently finished. The greedy, cold-blooded invaders had been thoroughly annihilated and locked away inside their respective cages. The undeniable natural order of my universe had been thoroughly and aggressively restored. I watched the small, colored bobber float peacefully on the calm water, waiting patiently for a bite as the mountains began their morning song. Absolute perfect peace belongs only to those who possess the profound courage to ruthlessly defend it. My name is Victor Vance, and my sanctuary is finally, unconditionally, and thoroughly mine alone. From this entire ordeal, the most profound lesson I learned is that real power never needs to announce itself. Arrogance always mistakes silence for weakness and humility for ignorance. Trent and the Sterling family looked at my age, my background, and my quiet lifestyle and instantly assumed I was a helpless target they could easily consume. They relied entirely on loud bragging and superficial status, while I relied on decades of true hard work and highly calculated patience. Real strength is built in the shadows through resilience and grit, not by maxing out credit cards simply to impress a bunch of strangers who don't matter. Never, ever underestimate the person who stays quiet. If you enjoyed my story, please hit the like button on this video and share your honest thoughts in the comments section below.